Geek Bearing Gifts. Paranormal Dating Agency, Book 2. Written by Millie Taiden. Narrated by Lauren Sweet. Prologue. "So tell me what you're looking for," Mrs. Wilder said. She placed a large tray of cookies, biscuits, and coffee on the table in front of Nita Eilis. Nita's hands shook a little, and she swiped her sweaty palms on her pants. There was no reason to be nervous, but she couldn't stop the slight shake of her leg. "Well," she hesitated. How to explain? She'd had such a strange relationship with the opposite sex that there was not much there. What she looked for? More than she'd ever had. Probably ever would. But she'd try anyway. "Come on, girl." Mrs. Wilder clucked her tongue, motioning with a hand for her to get on with it. This wasn't Relationship Analysis 101, and if that were the case, they'd need way more than a few hours, and way more than a tray of cookies. A full, gallon-sized bottle of vodka would be a good start. It wasn't that she was emotionally scarred by a previous bad relationship, or anything like that. That, at least, would have been a sound explanation for her problem. She was okay getting physically close, but emotions were another thing. Mrs. Wilder took a seat across from her with a notepad, tucking her feet under her long, eyelet peasant skirt. "I told you I had someone in mind for you, but I called you in to give me more details of what you're looking for." Pulsing soreness started in the back of her head. Nice. She didn't need a migraine. All because she wanted to find a man, now that her cousin Tolly had fallen in love. Nita felt lonely most of the time that she spent with her cousin and the two men Tolly shared her life with. It's not that simple. It really wasn't. She'd been shy for so much of her youth that when she finally started to accept the fact that she was never going to be a skinny girl, she'd already reached adulthood. By then, she'd decided to hell with romance and just set on a path of learning about embracing her sexuality. That had all been great and good, but she hadn't had any deep, meaningful relationships with men other than her best friend in high school, and he didn't count. "Let's get down to business. What are you looking for? A hookup? 2 men? Marriage, babies, and picket fence? Are you looking for a man to do some naughty things to you while you're tied up?" "Mrs. Wilder!" she gasped. Damn, she hadn't expected that. All that internal brooding had made her forget Mrs. Wilder could ask some off-the-wall questions. Tolly had told her that Mrs. Wilder was not the usual elderly woman. But geez. "I don't have all day, you know. I need my beauty sleep," Mrs. Wilder said. With her new flipped bob and perfect makeup on her wrinkleless features, she was hot for whatever her age was. Mrs. Wilder followed up her words with a smile and picked up her coffee. "You strike me as a woman who knows what she wants." Nita thought about that for a moment, panic rising in her chest. She did know what she wanted, usually. The best relationship she'd ever had with the opposite sex hadn't been sexual. It had been open, honest, trusting. Did that make her a freak? "I want a man to want me for me." Hearing the words come out of her mouth made her wince. A troubled knot tightened around her heart, clasping her normal self-assurance in a vice grip. "I wasn't wanted by boys growing up. Most girls didn't want to be around the fat girl. When someone did take the time to talk to me, they wanted something, and that something was usually to make fun of me." Except for Kai. He'd never done that. All right, she really needed therapy. Mrs. Wilder's previous smile dropped. The color of her eyes turned a bright blue, almost icy. Her features tightened and an animalistic noise sounded from her. "Tell me that someone stopped all that." She nodded her head up and down like a bobblehead, worried about Mrs. Wilder getting so upset. "Yes, my mother was very active in my school. I also had some great teachers who were always watching out for me. even an old friend that encouraged me daily. Okay. Mrs. Wilder breathed in deep, her face returning to her human side. So you see, I want a man that will be interested in me as a person, not just for sex. Not for money, which I don't have. Not for whatever he might think he can get out of me. I want to be wanted for the woman inside. And I sure as hell want to be wanted sexually, too. Mrs. Wilder cocked her head to the side, staring at her with soulful eyes. Darling, there are many sides to you. Your beauty, your body, your wit, your abilities at work. What do you want to focus on, if anything in particular? She leaned back on the sofa, the seat dipping under her butt. The leather squeaked with the weight of her body. I want more than sex. Don't get me wrong, sex is great. Mrs. Wilder snorted. Her eyes turned bright with amusement. Her lips twisted in a smirk, and a small dimple showed on her right cheek. She appeared even younger when she smiled. Sex is amazing when done correctly, especially if you can figure out how to be all alpha and make your legs shake. Oh, damn. She choked on the cookie she'd taken a bite of, chocolate spewing from her lips with each cough. She'd picked up a napkin and tried to clear her throat. Mrs. Wilder was a freak. Right, yes. I'm not saying I don't want hot sex. Hell, I'd love some hot sex. I haven't had good sex in a long time. She mumbled, feeling all kinds of uneasy after saying that to Mrs. Wilder. Mrs. Wilder raised her brows high. Her blue eyes went into a dark sapphire color, and there was a hint of confusion in them. I thought you wanted more than sex. Great. Now she wasn't just confusing herself with all this. Poor Mrs. Wilder looked like she was ready to pull her hair out. I want to be able to connect with someone more than physically. I want to feel the comfort of having that. That? Mrs. Wilder asked, her gaze probing. How to explain it? That feeling like you're meant for each other. That there are no secrets between you. I want a relationship. I don't want a booty call. Okay, Mrs. Wilder exclaimed, and then wrote in a leather notebook. Now we're getting somewhere. No booty calls for Nita. She glanced up from the notebook. I do hope you will want sex once you establish this man is right for you. Yes. She thought back to her last boyfriend, if she could call him that. They'd met up whenever, had dinner or drinks, and sex. The memory of their sex made her flinch. Nothing to write home about. Though he tried to breach the distance she'd always placed between them, eventually he gave up. That's how it always happened. She needed to be with someone who brought trust and comfort out in her, so she didn't have her guard up. So why is it so hard for you to find the right man? Mrs. Wilder tossed the question out of left field. Boy, when she hit with a question, she hit hard. I don't know. Mrs. Wilder rolled her eyes. For an old lady, she had a very youthful and bitchy personality. She reminded her of her cousin Tolly. Yes, you do, Mrs. Wilder declared, her voice more assertive than that of Nita's worst high school teacher. Talk about bossy. If she weren't so hopeful that she would match her to a halfway decent guy, she wouldn't be there talking about sex with a woman as old as her mom. All right. It's because I refuse to get too emotionally attached. Plus, most of my past boyfriends said I'm kind of distant. She grumbled, breaking the cookie on her plate into tiny crumbs. Whatever that means. It means you need to let shit go and open your heart to love, Mrs. Wilder said, point blank. Are you willing to do that? Take a chance on a good guy? If you don't, you won't ever find what you're looking for. Shit. The old woman was right. She knew it, too. That smug smile on her lips said it all. Mrs. Wilder had just pointed out Nita's biggest issue, and it was up to her now to fix it. I can do it. Even if it killed her. She didn't want to live in the meaningless sex realm any longer. She wanted love, emotions. She wanted happiness. What the hell. She wanted marriage and babies, too. Then I think my first choice for you is probably the right one. Mrs. Wilder grinned. One. So, tell me again where you're going? Tolly asked from her side of the phone line. Her voice, loud and clear, bounced around the interior of the car through the Bluetooth connection. Nita glanced at her rearview mirror for the millionth time and sighed. She grimaced, ready to lie to her cousin even though she didn't want to. She hated lies with a passion. In fact, just the thought of lying to Tolly made her stomach burn with discomfort. She knew she was a sucky liar, so she preferred not to do it. Plus, lies always got people in trouble. Every single time. It wasn't that Tolly would judge. Not at all. But she already felt like an idiot because she was thinking of going out of her way to go on a date with one of the shifters from Mrs. Wilder's paranormal dating agency. She'd allowed herself to be roped into a multiple-day date. Not that she'd ever heard of one of those before, nor ever done it in her life. The acid in her stomach burned up to her throat. She should have eaten something before her drive, but excitement had made it impossible. Mrs. Wilder had been very particular about keeping details of who her date was concealed. When she finally gave her the details, Nita'd been ready to hit the road for the mountains. I don't want you to have any preconceived notions going in, she'd said. This is something new, and you're both going to have to trust my judgment. Trusting her judgment had strangely been easier than she would have expected. Maybe it was her hope for Mrs. Wilder to be right. Her words had told her one thing. Unlike Tolly, she'd be getting one date, and not two. Which was okay with Nita. She didn't think she had the patience to deal with two growly alpha males. I'm just going to have a mini vacation for a few days, she lied. If all went well, she'd have a few days with a guy that might be the man of her dreams. Or a match made in hell. Whatever the deal, she'd only brought a few days' worth of clothes, so she had an excuse to leave, should she need it. Besides, she had a full week of Shark Week and Naked and Afraid on her DVR that she'd yet to watch. She winced. She'd have to remember to make sure not to mention that to her date. The last guy she'd gone out with had given her a laundry list of reasons why watching any reality show was going to destroy all her smart brain cells. She'd wanted to tell him that his rant had killed any semblance of sexual spark in her. Other than the amazing drinks the bartender kept bringing her way, the date had been more uncomfortable than a visit to a new GYN. She had high hopes for this new guy, though. Mrs. Wilder had been so excited to match her up, it had given Nita a big ego boost. Apparently there were men out there who liked really curvy Latinas with a chocolate addiction and a bit of a sarcasm problem. Who knew? You do not leave your doctor without an assistant, ever, so this is just not normal, Tolly replied, her tone sharper than usual with what sounded like worry. Nita could imagine her cousin frowning as she spoke on the other end of the line. Tolly knew her better than anyone. Nita was happy to have a good time anytime, but when it came to her job, she had a strict, no fucking up rule. I need a little break. Sometimes it's good to take a few days to just eat ice cream, watch bad TV, and wear PJs all day. Nita laughed, hoping Tolly would think she was being honest. Though all those things sounded damn good to her. Maybe she would go home and do them all if her date went to shit. Yeah, I guess. Tolly didn't sound convinced. A glance at her GPS told her she had another half-hour drive in the quiet, frickin' lone stretch of road. Nighttime fast approached. She should have made it a daytime date. but she'd been so damn excited about going on a date with the shifter, she'd forgotten all about her fear of the dark. Thankfully, she always carried around pepper spray in her bag, not because she liked drama or fights, but because she didn't want to ever be caught unaware by anyone. She lived in a dangerous city. Anything could happen. Besides, you, Connor, and Theron are busy getting to know each other. You don't need me hanging around like a fourth wheel. Tolly gasped. Nita Eilis, how could you even say something like that? You're not a fourth wheel. Yeah, right. She definitely felt like a fourth wheel whenever they met up at a restaurant or for some drinks. Connor and Theron were all over Tolly. She wasn't jealous of her cousin. Hell, she was so happy she could squeeze the two men to bits. It was the fact she didn't have anyone in her life worth a smile that made it so difficult. God damn it. She wanted her own man all over her, groping her ass like they were teenagers on a first date. Have you called Mrs. Wilder? Tolly suddenly asked. Tolly growled on the other end of the line. Why won't you do it already? I really think it could be helpful for you. Again, she wasn't keeping things from Tolly. She loved Tolly more than most of her family, other than her parents and her grandma Kate. It's just that with her past relationship having turned into something out of the Twilight Zone, Nita didn't want to talk about anything without knowing where it was going first. I'm going to trust her to find me a man. I promise. She was going to hell in a limo at this point. Where were the antacid pills when she needed them? Lying to her best friend was bad. But Tolly loved her. That made things that much worse. Okay, as long as you try. Tolly said something so softly, Nita didn't make it out. I'm going to have to go now. We're about to go out to dinner and a show. That was another thing. How in the hell did Tolly end up with the best of both worlds? Hot man who did everything she wanted and amazing sex. Nita had never had it that good. The closest she'd come was the bare best friend in high school, Kai. And even though she hadn't cared about his features, he'd been a good-looking guy. He'd been so shy, she'd had to make sure their friendship never turned weird by telling him how much she liked him. Her extra limb is what Nita's mom had called him. Wherever she went, he went. For her entire sophomore year of high school, he'd been her rock. There had been things they didn't discuss, like guys or girls. He got a bit growly at her mention of him finding a girlfriend. Not that she wanted him to go out there and find anyone who would take too much of his attention. It's just that Nita had been a big girl since she was born. It wasn't that she ate unhealthy foods, though she had a sweet tooth that would make any baker delighted. She ate normal and exercised regularly with her dad. She was just big. The last thing she expected was for anyone as cute as Kai to ever notice her. She'd had insecurity issues as a kid, major ones, with a side of shyness. In order for her to finally accept that she needed to embrace her body because it was the only one she had, she'd ended up going to therapy. It didn't end there. There was a mass of dietitians with meal and exercise plans. Her mother also took her to various health professionals that worked alongside her to help grow Nita's self-esteem. After a few years, she finally learned to love her body. Once she did, it was so much easier and fun to be sexy and sensual. It stopped being uncomfortable for her to wear the sparkly short skirts and some of the tops that plunged and showed off her abundant cleavage. She was a new person, all because she stopped hiding behind what others thought and allowed herself to be Nita Eilis, curvy Latina. By the time she had found herself, learned to love Nita, and stopped letting haters take her self-esteem, she'd moved away from Kai. Her heart ached for her old friend. She could only hope he found some way to outgrow his own shyness and embrace the handsome, geeky guy inside. It was already dark by the time she reached the cabin. She hoped her host hadn't waited too long. A peek at her dashboard clock said she was only half an hour late. Damn it. A stickler for time, she hated being late, especially when she knew how much of an impact keeping correct times made in her life. She glanced down at her wrinkled ankle pants and pretty but not overtly sexual purple top. Then she lifted her arms and sniffed to make sure she didn't stink. Nope, all was good there. Since she knew how sensitive Shifter's senses were, she had decided to opt for a light perfume. She pulled out a tube of cherry lip gloss out of her bag and popped 2 breath mints. It wasn't a shower and toothpaste, but that's as good as it was going to get. With a quick, deep breath, she hopped out of her Prius and hiked to the cabin. Fall fast approached, and that meant the temperature was just perfect for being outside without sweating bullets. She hoped her date liked walks. Her heart started to hammer hard in her chest the closer she got to the door. What if he wasn't right with her? What if Mrs. Wilder had made a mistake? Fuck it. She kicked the kernel of insecurity in the ass and knocked on the door. The knock pushed the door slightly open. "Hello?" she called out into the homey interior. She wasn't trying to get into the guy's life, but he had a place built for comfort. Long brown leather sofas with pretty gold and yellow decorative pillows sat in the living room. She pushed the front door open some more. Maybe he couldn't hear her. Did she really want to date a shifter that was hard of hearing? Tolly had told her they were known for their wonderful sensitive hearing. Figured, she snorted. Her date would probably end up being an old, hard-of-hearing shifter who probably couldn't shift. Now Mrs. Wilder's words made sense about having preconceived ideas of him. Dear God, what if he couldn't get it up? "Oh, hell no," she said through gritted teeth. The guy wasn't home for their date. He probably forgot her. Her temperature rose with her anger. How could he not be home and leave his door open? Nobody in the city did that. Curiosity made her take another step inside and call out again. "Anybody home?" She wasn't really breaking and entering, since she'd been invited there. At least, she hoped using that as an excuse when her date showed up worked. She moved deeper into the large cabin. It smelled delicious, like someone had been cooking all day. That calmed her some. The cabin was big. What if he couldn't hear her from wherever he was? Pitchers filled with fresh wildflowers sat at every table. Still no sign of her host. Maybe he'd gone out to run an errand. If that was the case, why was there a massive Jeep parked in front? It made no sense to her. She strolled through the cabin with caution, but still managed to oogle every beautiful piece of carved furniture. His dining room table was gigantic, with enough chairs to sit her entire family, and then some. She started making up a story in her head about her date. He had so many children and grandchildren that he had to have a big table. He had to be really old at this point, like ancient. Nita tried not to giggle, considering her date had clearly forgotten she was coming. It was obvious between the two of them that she'd been the only one excited for their date. "Hello?" she yelled louder. Nothing. The scent of food drifted from the open kitchen. She strolled into the space and bit back a moan. Christ, if there had ever been a kitchen made with lots of cooking in mind, this was it. Whoever picked the cabinets had done an amazing job. They were made of a beautiful wood that blended the inside with the outdoors. It was the huge stove and 2 double ovens that made Nita's mouth water. She loved baking. It helped her relax. Not that she was as good as Tolly or Mrs. Wilder, but she hadn't killed anyone so far. Seeing this kitchen was heaven. Her date had already earned brownie points in her book, and he wasn't even there. She stalked closer to the huge refrigerator and almost tripped on something. A pair of feet. She gasped. What the hell? Rounding the corner in a flash, she lost her breath at the sight of the large man sprawled on the shiny wood floor of the kitchen. He was so big that she stood there for a second, unsure what to do. Something clicked in her head, and she moved closer. Once she reached him, she kneeled beside the man's face, which was turned to the side. She tried not to gawk, but it was impossible. He lay there in nothing but a towel, his muscled body displayed for her to view and touch, if she dared. That was so wrong, so very wrong. But he was passed out. One tiny feel of his six-pack wouldn't really be so bad, would it? "Bad, Nita. This guy needs your help, not for you to drool over his passed-out body." She gently turned his head to face her. Air caught at the back of her throat. He was frickin' gorgeous. The hair on his chest wasn't so thick that she could still make out the muscles underneath it. Her throat went dry. Her palms itched to touch him and see how smooth he'd feel. She imagined running her nails over him and grazing them down to his inny belly button. Even that was sexy. Her gaze shot down to where the towel hung precariously over his hips, the sides having slid over to reveal his muscular and slightly hairy thigh. Dear God, without a doubt she was going to hell. If not hell, at least somewhere she would be punished for lusting after a passed-out, probably dead, mountain man. How long had it been since the last time she had had sex that she was now mentally licking this poor man while he lay there needing help? She raised a trembling hand to his neck to feel for a pulse. He was alive. Thank you, God. This was probably the first time she'd ever given a silent prayer that a first date wasn't really avoiding her. "Hello?" Calling softly to him, she cupped his face in her hands. There was a large gash on the other side of his head, and blood matted his hair. She should call 911 and stop feeling on the guy. Darn it, but she couldn't help herself. She tried to tap his face, but ended up sliding her finger over his scruffy jaw. Yup, she was a pervert, taking advantage of a man down. That ticket to hell was now first class on the fastest jet known to man. A soft groan sounded from the big guy. "Wake up, sleeping beauty." She couldn't help herself. Should she kiss him? That would probably only add to her list of infractions in the book What Not to Do with a Passed-Out Stranger. She was dying to see his eyes. She knew they'd be spectacular. Sure enough, a few blinks, and his long, thick lashes fluttered open to a piercing stare. He lifted a hand to the one she had on his cheek and covered it with his own. Oxygen froze in her lungs. His eyes might be hazel, but there was something about him that told her she knew him. She couldn't know him. She'd never have forgotten someone this big, this sexy, this naked. She swallowed hard at the nerves knotting in the back of her throat. "Hi." Sexy man licked his lips and winced. Fuck. For someone who worked in the medical field, she was acting like an amateur. His head probably hurt, and there she was feeling on him like a sex-starved maniac, probably breaking some laws in the process. Kai Stone's bear rumbled for him to wake up. The soft, sexy scent of the mate he'd long ago given up filled his lungs. Another rumble from the bear, and the fog slowly dissipated. The scent of his mate grew stronger still. The bear pushed for a shift, but even though he wasn't fully awake, Kai was in control. Another rumble, and the bear made his muscles ache with the strength of his power. He wanted out. Now. Hold on. He'd let the bear roam soon. Right now, he needed to open his eyes and deal with the world. Except he couldn't find it in him to let go of the scent growing more powerful by the second. Nita. So he lay in the half-aware state if only to hold on to her scent a little longer. Only problem was the bear's loud roar inside was hard to tamp down. The animal was angry. So was Kai. His head hurt, and he knew someone had come in and hit him from behind when he'd been arguing with his sister over her matchmaking ways. She'd called to tell him she'd set him up on a blind date, without his knowledge. Knowing Jess, she must have thought he'd hung up on her, angry over what she'd done when the call had gotten cut off. He didn't need or want any female. The one he'd known long ago belonged to him. Back then, he'd been a gangly teen with braces. He'd also had a massive case of shyness around Nita. Her beautiful smile and sparkling brown eyes had made him tongue-tied more times than he could count. "Wake up, Sleeping Beauty." He heard her voice now. Shit. He must have been hit hard enough that he was hallucinating. Why would the world be so cruel as to do that to him? He hadn't seen or heard from her in almost 17 years. Not that he hadn't had women in that time. He was no saint. But he knew as well as his bear that Nita was the one for them. He took a deep breath, and her scent, sexy and warm, along with some flowery perfume, filled his lungs. If this was a hallucination, he needed serious help. Fuck help. He wanted to savor every second of it. Then he felt the slight touch of her fingers over his jaw, caressing him so lightly he thought he might have imagined it too, except the bear wouldn't imagine it. He roared under his skin. The animal pushed to get out and be near her. Quiet. His bear wouldn't listen, though. Another rumble sounded from the animal. If she wasn't a hallucination, she'd hear his bear soon. Two. Kai opened his eyes to an older, much more beautiful Nita. She leaned over him. Her hair, long ago, held in a curly ponytail, now fell straight in a long mass. He met her gaze and watched her pupils dilate. Arousal. A slow smile crept over her full lips. A stream of light from the kitchen lamp covered her head in a halo. "Hi, I'm Nita Eilis." Jesus. He wasn't hallucinating. She was real flesh and blood. She was in his house, touching him. What the fuck had he missed? He tried to sit up, but she pushed him down. "Don't move. There's a gash on the side of your head. You're Kyer Ash, right?" Why was she using his full first name and half of his last name? Nobody called him Kyer, Ashstone, or Ash. He was Kai Stone since he was a 10-year-old that got sick of being picked on because of his slim weight and name. "Yes, that's me. Just call me Kai." A pretty rose color swept over her cheeks. "Hi, Kai. I'm sorry, I'll call 911. I just got distracted, trying to make sure you were alive." No need to call anyone." He couldn't figure out why she was lying about making sure he was alive, but when she bit her bottom lip, he realized he didn't really care. It was his Nita, and she was there. "What are you doing here?" he asked, dying to know. Her brown eyes went wide. "Oh my gosh, maybe that hit to your head was worse than I thought. Did you forget our date?" She lifted a perfectly manicured hand and held 2 fingers up. "How many fingers am I holding up?" 2. "Times what?" she asked, a worried pitch in her voice. If she hadn't appeared so concerned, he'd have laughed at the ridiculous question. 1. She blinked in clear shock. "You don't know your times table, or were you guessing?" Jesus. She, of all people, knew that he knew his times table backward, forward, and squared. He pushed up to a sitting position, but didn't push away her hand. In fact, He moved closer to her. The bear rumbled softly. He liked what Kai had done. Sly bear. "We had a date." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Now he knew why his sister had been so excited about his date. She'd found Nita. Nita nodded. One thing bothered him. She wasn't looking at him like she knew him. In fact, why wasn't she saying anything about their past? "Yes, but under the circumstances, I am more than happy to postpone." She grabbed his arm and helped him to his feet. He leaned closer to her, bringing his body flush against her soft curves, and then faked a flinch. She curled her arms around his abs in an effort to offer more support. He might feel like an ass tomorrow, but right now, he'd take her touch and enjoy it. "Don't go," he rumbled. The bear, so close to the surface, made his voice deeper. She offered her physical support to help him to the breakfast table he usually ate his meals at, unless someone from the clan showed up with a problem. Being chief of the Stone Clan meant he dealt with issues all the time, mainly over other clans in the area wanting to feed at their lake. "Don't worry, big guy. I'll stay until I'm sure you won't pass out again." She whispered the words, her breath caressing his neck. It was hard to think past the pain in his head. To make matters worse, she inhaled, brushing her nose over his jaw. His cock went rock hard. He sat down and drank in the vision of his mate, the sole woman to make his bear and the man he was whole. The aching gape in his chest filled with hope. Then it occurred to him. She didn't remember the geeky teen with glasses, bad haircut, and braces. The image of him as a super skinny kid with clothes that fell off his gangly body wasn't really going to get in his way. He could seduce Nita as the man he was now. Bigger, stronger, self-assured. He was the chief of the Stone Bear clan. He knew his body had changed. He knew women wanted him. Hell, watching lust flare in Nita's eyes while he'd been on the floor had been unreal. He didn't have the self-esteem issues now that he did back when he wanted to ask her to the movies, but ended up offering to tutor her instead. Though that had been one of the best mistakes he'd ever made. The time they'd spent together had been better than any single date. Going to the movies wasn't going to tell him how much she loved watching TV with her feet curled under a blanket. It didn't matter what they saw. She'd always hide her feet. Nor would he have found out that she moaned when she ate her favorite brand of ice cream, much to his discomfort. He would have never seen the smile of happiness when she told him of the latest book she read and how much she loved it when the hero and heroine ended up together and happy. All those and dozens of other regular, everyday things he'd learned from tutoring her and spending a lot of time as her friend. She glanced around his kitchen, then back at the right side of his face. "Let me get something to clean that with." She rushed to the sink and wet a dish towel before returning back to him to wipe blood off his head. He didn't bother telling her the wound was almost healed, nor did he explain he wasn't so much in pain as he was angry over the hit. Whoever had done it would be found out. Then they'd regret it. They'd knocked him out at the worst possible time. He'd been arguing with Jessica over setting him up. Now that he thought about it, his bear had been agitated right before he was hit. If he'd paid attention to his animal's anger, he'd have known something was going on. But instead he'd been angry over Jess's matchmaking. How could he ever find the words to thank her for bringing Nita into his life again? She reeled back when her hand caressed under his ear. "I'm sorry, did that hurt?" Hell fuck no. It felt damn amazing, and he wanted her to do it again. She thought he moved back from the pain. It had been a pure jolt of pleasure that blasted him and caught him unaware. "No, it's okay." He mumbled the words out. Curling his hands into fists, he tried to stop the urge to pull her over his lap and kiss her, to finally touch her lips to his and see how it would feel. He'd been dreaming of that day for almost 17 years. Knowing she was there now was a shock to his system. She moved back and forth in his kitchen like she belonged there. Who was he kidding? She did belong there, with him as his mate. He was having a hard time keeping the tongue-tied teen out of his mind and figuring out how to talk to her like the man he'd become. A leader, a chief, someone who knew his own sex appeal. This was Nita, his Nita. He didn't want to sweet-talk her like any other female. He wanted what he'd always wanted from her. Her love. "How's your head?" she asked, rinsing the towel for the third time, her hips swinging with her movements. She was so sexy, so sensual. That outfit, though proper, had fueled every dirty fantasy he had ever had and multiplied it. The tight pants molded to her curvy hips and showed off her ass beautifully. Her purple top was cut low up front for a mouth-watering display of her breasts. She'd never dressed this way as a teen. All her clothes had been so large and covered her up. He never really had a chance to lust over her like he did now. All those curves, wide at the hips and narrow at the waist, with enough to grab onto when he drove deep into her. Fuck, fuck, fuck. He should not be thinking of sex now. Not now. "Still hurting, huh?" She scrunched up her nose and gave him a sympathetic smile. "I'm sorry. So what happened? Did you slip and fall or something?" "Something all right." He cleared his throat. He couldn't go into the details with her, not when he didn't know what the hell happened. He'd definitely be finding out soon, though. Growling sounded from where she stood. "Tell me you didn't hear that," she said, her cheeks tinged red with embarrassment. "I did." He scrubbed a hand over the back of his neck. "Your stomach is trying to tell me what a horrible host I am." She groaned and widened her eyes. "You're not. You were hurt." "I'm sorry." He found his manners. "Are you hungry?" The sound her stomach made, and the fact she kept eyeing the food his sister had come over and cooked earlier, told him she needed something to eat soon. If Nita was anything like she'd been as a teen, she would get cranky when hungry. "I guess I must be. The drive wasn't long, but I was so busy all day, I didn't get a chance to eat anything." She grinned and handed him the clean towel. "Let me grab some clothes really quick, and we'll eat." "But your head
is fine. I'll be back in a second,"
he said, and stood. He marched to his bedroom and threw some clean clothes on, only to rush back to the kitchen. She shoved him back in his seat. "Here, you sit. Hold this," she said, handing him the washcloth once again. "Tell me where everything is, and I'll bring the food to you." Nita had always been a nice person, caring and considerate of those she felt deserved it. She'd always covered that with a layer of insecurity that kept most people at bay. He'd never seen the self-assurance in her as a kid that he saw now. He pointed to a cupboard.
"Plates are in there. Utensils are in the drawer by your left hand."
In no time, the food was on the table, and she was helping serve it. He would have felt bad, if not for the fact he really loved watching her move around his kitchen. Okay, she could have stayed in one spot, and he'd still have been staring at her like a lovesick fool. "How's the head?" she asked before starting to eat. He glanced down at his plate, instead of staring at her lips for the billionth time. He should be over his geek boy ways. Well, most of them. He still wore glasses as a human when his contacts irritated him. As a bear, his vision was good enough that he didn't have to worry about his sight. Besides, He'd never live it down if his clansmen saw him in his bear with a pair of black-framed glasses on.
I'm fine, really. It wasn't a big deal, but thanks for your concern.
He reached out a hand and placed it over hers. Her gaze shot down to his large hand covering hers. It looked pretty bad, but maybe it was all the blood. You sure you don't need a doctor? He brushed his thumb over the top of her hand.
No, doctor. I'd never live it down if my clan knew I went for a tiny scratch like that.
You must be a bleeder. She stared at his mouth, and his blood traveled south. He gripped the spoon tight enough to bend it and attempted a smile.
No, I'm a bear. I heal faster than others.
Of course. She laughed, her top dropping a fraction lower to show more of her cleavage. He shouldn't be staring at her chest, but he was a geek, not an idiot. I should have known that's why you stopped bleeding, and your wound appeared to have healed before my eyes. He didn't tell her the wound had been bad at first, but his bear had been huffing and roaring him back to health. During the moments he'd been unconscious, the bear had quickly pushed for him to come to his senses. That link between man and animal had saved his life more than a few times.
What did you think I was?
From what Jess told him, the site she'd used to set him up with was a paranormal dating agency, and so Nita should have known he was not human. She shrugged. I didn't stop to think about it, to be honest. The right side of her top slid down her shoulder to reveal a purple polka-dot studded bra strap. Fucking hell. Why did fate torture him with glimpses of her undergarments? What he wanted to do was tear all her clothes off. His cock ached, and she'd been there for all of a few hours. By the end of the night, he'd have blue balls. I guess I was so caught up in you being passed out and bleeding that I didn't focus on the fact you can probably heal faster than I can from a paper cut. She smiled, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Don't tell me what really happened was that you fainted. He roared a laugh. She was still just as funny as she'd been back in high school.
Do I look like a fainter?
She lifted the iced tea to her lips and took a swallow. He watched her throat work. He knew he was in serious trouble when that turned him on. She lowered the glass slowly, and he was put through the torture of watching her lick the remaining drops of her drink from her lips. Damn it. He had to struggle the bear back. Kai wanted her. Now. No, you don't. But trust me when I tell you, I have seen bigger men than you cry and scream at the sight of blood. Some have outright fainted when they saw a needle. He frowned at her words.
Are you a doctor?
She shook her head, laughed, and pulled her hand out of his. I'm going to need this to eat.
You could always break a record for one-handed eating.
She grinned. Not in this lifetime. This stew looks divine. No way in hell I'm going to struggle eating with one hand. You might be cute, Mr. Bear, but I am a hungry girl. Did she call him cute? Never had Kai loved hearing those words from a woman more than he did at that moment. He didn't want for her to see what a big deal it was, so he laughed it off.
Hey, your loss. That is pretty big in some parts of the world. I bet the Guinness Book of World Records people would be marveled. Fastest time for one-handed eating of stew might be a popular one. You never know.
Right. She slipped her spoon into the stew, inhaled, and groaned. This smells better than it did when I walked in. Thank God for Jess and her love of making the seafood stew. She knew that was his favorite. He thought that she'd come over to sweeten him up, like she usually did when she wanted him to release some of the money from her trust. His younger sister was too rash to handle her own money, and he knew it. That didn't mean she wouldn't have moments of weakness, where she wanted to go on massive shopping sprees and begged him to loosen the purse strings.
Yeah, it will taste amazing, too,
he said, digging his spoon into the delicious meal his sister had made. The scent of spices and fish made the bear inside him growl with hunger. Gotta love a man that is so confident in his cooking. She chuckled and slid the spoon between her lips. He held his breath as he watched her close her eyes and do the adult version of the moans he'd seen her do while eating ice cream as a teen. Oh, my God, this is so good. Hot damn. His throat went dry all over again, and he had a hard time remembering to breathe.
I told you it was amazing.
She blinked, like she just remembered he was there, and slowly swiped her tongue over her bottom lip. Yeah, I should have listened to you. You're a great cook. His heartbeat pounded in his chest so hard he worried she could hear it. He wanted badly to take her compliment for himself, but he wasn't going to lie about it.
My sister did the cooking. She came over earlier to surprise me.
Nita's slow lift of her lips into a sassy smile made his heart trip. What a great sister. Was she worried you'd scare me off with your cooking? He shook his head, noticing how easy their conversation was. Things between them felt like they'd never been apart, even with her not remembering him.
No, she worried I'd feed you grilled fish and vegetables. According to her, it's the only decent thing I can make.
Nita snorted, biting her lip. He saw her struggle to keep a straight face. I don't believe you. A big guy like you has to eat more than that. He loved the playful look in her eyes. That twinkle did what so many dates in the past never had. It made him smile. It was like old times, but better.
I am also very adept at making peanut butter and jelly with bananas.
Ooh, my favorite. She lowered the spoon and picked up a piece of bread. A man after my heart. He'd never forgotten her favorite snack. Nita and those sandwiches, along with the memories of his time with her, were the reason he'd make some. Just to think of her. What made you hire a dating agency? She asked, chewing the piece of bread so slowly he became entranced in watching her jaw movement.
Nothing. I didn't hire the dating agency.
He licked his lips and glanced down at his bowl. His food had disappeared, but he didn't remember consuming any of it. So how did we end up here? The temperature in the kitchen rose the longer he watched her eat. Her breath hitched every few bites, like she couldn't stop herself from enjoying the meal.
My sister set it up.
Much to his frustration at first. Now, though, he couldn't be happier and planned to express his gratitude by hugging his sister to bits. She met his gaze. There was a question in her eyes and a flash of insecurity. He decided to reassure her.
I'm happy she did, though.
Her smile warmed him from the inside. I'm glad I used the agency, too. Three. Nita had butterflies in her stomach. When was the last time that happened? Other than the few times Kai had brushed his hand over hers back in high school? Never. Men had come and gone, and none had made her feel all kinds of sweaty and slightly dazed with just their conversation. She couldn't believe how nice and funny her date was. The more she spoke to him and stared at his gorgeous face, the more she swore she'd seen him somewhere before. It was his eyes. Something about the hazel color, going back and forth from green to gold, was driving her to distraction. She opened her mouth to ask him about his childhood when someone strolled into the kitchen.
Hey, Chief, I smell food,
a man said, stopping short at the sight of her and her date, smiling over empty plates.
Liam, what are you doing here?
Kai asked, his tone not so much brusque, but surprised. Liam was a big guy with short, dark hair and a light, scruffy beard similar to the one Kai had. The only difference was that Kai had golden, spiky hair and hazel eyes, that still had her knees jellified. Kai also had a 1,000-watt smile with perfect teeth. Then there were his lips. Lord Almighty, she couldn't wait to kiss them. Liam's surprise turned into a knowing smile after a moment. He folded his large arms over his plain black t-shirt and shrugged.
Jess called. She asked me to come over and see you. She didn't elaborate. I took it to mean you were in the middle of piling up some firewood for your den and needed help. I'm fine. I don't need help,
Kai said. He stood, taking the empty bowls and placing them in the sink. The clinking of spoons and glass, the only sound in the kitchen for the moment.
Liam, this is Nita. Nita, Liam. Nita?
Liam's eyes widened with surprise. Yes, nice to meet you, Liam. But, Nita grinned at Liam, I think he needs to see a doctor to have that wound checked. Liam's smile disappeared.
Wound? I'm fine, Kai replied. We'll discuss it later.
Liam's brows lowered in a fierce scowl. A low growl sounded from where he stood.
I understand.
I'm really sorry, Kai. I just think you should seek a professional medical opinion. You could have done some damage we're not aware of. Head wounds are very dangerous. Kai stopped piling plates in the sink and turned to her. She thought he might be angry over her words, but instead, he grinned at her as if she'd said something funny.
Thank you for your concern. It is incredibly humbling.
Wow. His smile when he said that was so sexy, and his eyes turned a dark forest green. Fire crawled into a ball in her belly, and air caught in her lungs. Hell, her heart did little flips in her chest.
I should go then,
Liam offered. No. What the hell was she doing? Please, stay. Yes, she needed Liam to stay, or she might do something bad. At her age, she needed a chaperone. This was going too well, and she didn't want to mess it up by getting naked too soon. Naked could be good, though. Real good. She continued to chastise herself for not tugging on the towel while he'd been passed out. At least lifting a corner or something. It's not like he would have known. There was something about Kai that reminded her of someone. She snorted internally. If he weren't so big, she might have said he reminded her of the other Kai, her high school friend. As it was, this Kai was enormous, with that sexy as sin beard, and, holy molasses, all those muscles. She needed Liam to stay, or she might climb Kai like a tree. Probably hump him like a dog, too.
Are you sure?
Liam asked, glancing at Kai for a moment. Yes, she replied. She turned to glance out the kitchen window. It's late, and the cabin I'm staying at isn't far from here, so I should go.
You don't have to go.
Kai was quick to reply.
I have a guest cabin.
She grinned, a sense of happiness expanding in her chest. He wanted her to stay. Not that she wanted to go, but seeing his instant offer made her feel they were going in the right direction. I know. That's where I'm staying. Did you forget that part too? Liam's loud chuckle filled the kitchen. It amused her to see a flush of color cover Kai's pale cheeks. He was so damn cute. Cute, with a body she could do some dirty things to. She wanted to strip him down to nothing and lick him from head to toe. Shit. Her thoughts had turned sexual. Not good. Pretty soon she'd start visualizing him naked. Big buff bear in all his growly glory. Dear God. Too late. The image of Kai with nothing but that sexy smile on his face popped into her head. She almost slapped her forehead to her brain to cut it out, but it was useless. Another image of Kai took hold of her mind. In this one, he was prowling toward her, his large body looming over hers. Then in her head, he lowered and kissed her senseless.
I really think I should go.
Liam cleared his throat, taking a few steps back. Nonsense. I'm going to need some sleep soon. I'll just head over to that cabin Mrs. Wilder mentioned. She gave me directions.
I'll take you.
Kai cut in.
Liam, stay here. We'll talk when I return.
Nita stood from the kitchen table. Her body felt tight and flushed. If she got any more turned on by thinking of Kai, she'd end up ravishing him in the woods. When did she start using the word ravish, anyway? That was Tolly rubbing off on her. I need to grab my overnight bag, and we are good to go, she told Kai. Then she offered her hand to Liam. It was nice meeting you.
The pleasure was all mine,
he said, with a flirty wink that probably got him lots of women bowing at his feet.
Trust me.
She had the feeling he was trying to tell her something, but she couldn't figure out what. He could just be messing with her after the way she told on Kai for being hurt. Once she'd gotten her bag from the car, Kai led her down a path by the side of his house. It was a pretty straight walk that took them by a creek not far from his cabin. That's gorgeous, she said, staring at the moon reflecting on the water. You must love living here. Leaves crunched under their feet as they walked, the sound almost overpowering the buzzing of the butterflies swarming her chest.
I do love living here.
He grabbed her hand to help her over some bumpy areas on the path. She wore sandals, but knew all about living near the mountains and had a pair of trainers and hiking boots in her bag.
What about you? How do you like living in the city?
He asked. She shrugged. I mostly grew up there. It's what I'm used to.
You've never lived outside of the city?
She nodded in the darkness, then realized he probably couldn't see that. Yes, I lived not far from here when I was a teenager. It only lasted about 2 years. Then we moved back home.
I guess you didn't enjoy it.
She frowned at the almost sad way he said the words. I like it. I think nature is beautiful, and with a cabin as gorgeous as the one you have, with no weird annoying neighbors close by, and a view to die for, plus the basic necessities, you'd be stupid to move to the city. I certainly wouldn't.
I do love living here. I can have peace and quiet. At the same time, my clan is not too far, so if they need me, I'm nearby.
They neared the smaller cabin. It was obvious someone had been there not long ago. The lights were turned on in a welcoming sight.
Jess,
he sighed, digging his hands in his back pocket. I'm sorry?
My sister came over and turned on the lights for you.
He rushed to add. At the door, she turned to him with a smile. I had fun at dinner. Are you still up for a day of walking in the woods tomorrow? He pushed the door to the miniature cabin open. It was the cutest thing ever. She'd seen tiny houses before on television, but had never actually stayed in one. The inside was decorated in earth tones that blended perfectly with their surroundings. Colors had been combined with furniture to give the small space country charm. This has to be the prettiest little cabin ever, she squealed. She felt like a big kid in a dollhouse. When she turned to glance at Kai, he was busy leaning on the front door, smiling at her. That smile. Oh, mother of all dirty thoughts. He gave her so many naughty visuals, she had to remember to breathe and keep her sexual depravity inside her head.
I'm glad you like it.
He chuckled, and she watched his chest rise and fall with his laughs.
My mother was fond of this cabin.
You have to love it. She sat down on one of the dainty sofas. It's like Alice in Wonderland. Kai raised a brow.
And who would I be, the Mad Hatter or the Crazy Cat?
She stood again and strolled toward him. I think you and Liam would make a great pair of Tweedledee and Tweedledum. She burst into giggles at his indignant expression. How could she talk to him like that? It was all him. Something about him allowed her to be herself. No pretending. She felt comfortable enough with him to joke around.
"Are you kidding me?"
"Yes, of course I'm kidding." She laughed. "I don't think Alice is the right fairy tale for you, Mr. Bear." She stopped a foot away from him, her muscles locked, fighting back the urge to get closer to him. A spark of interest lit in his eyes.
"What fairy tale would you see me in?"
She wanted to say a naughty version of Goldilocks, but she was definitely not the golden one of the two. With his blonde, spiky hair, he kicked any other version of Goldilocks in the ass. "I'll have to think about it." He glanced away from her, as if to leave, but then turned and closed the distance between them. She inhaled sharply, holding her breath. He got closer, until her back hit the wall and his body pressed flush against hers. Oh, dear God. If he didn't kiss her soon, she might stoop to begging. On her knees, since her legs were about to give out. She thought with the way he'd gone all serious on her, that he'd grab her hard and kiss her roughly. But no. Instead, he raised a hand slowly, sliding it up her arm. Goosebumps broke over her skin. Their gazes held in a hot, distracting lock that she didn't even want to break. He finally cupped her cheek so lightly, she almost swore he wasn't touching her. Her breaths pounded hard in her ears. Shivers raced down her back. She swallowed back the tiny whimpers trying to escape her throat. "Did you know?" he whispered, his head lowering with every breath she took. "That your eyes are the color of smooth milk chocolate and as bright as 1,000 stars." She'd never been told that, ever. She had brown eyes. Men had told her they were pretty, but nobody had compared it to something as decadent as chocolate. No one had said they were bright like stars. He said the words so quietly, she thought he was talking to himself. "And your smile," he continued, "is more beautiful than any blooming flower come spring." She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. It was then that he finally slanted his lips over hers. The slow burn into her blood flared into an intense inferno. He swiped his tongue over her lips first, tasting, probing, almost asking for permission before moving in on her. She didn't wait. She met his tongue with her own and rubbed hers over his in a bold stroke. A loud rumble vibrated from his chest. Then he pushed her harder against the wall, deepening the kiss. It was intoxicating. Fire and desire turned her insides into a ticking bomb of arousal. She whimpered, her nipples growing tight with need. She ached for relief. Flames of passion licked at her veins, warming her core, adding to the intense feeling of urgency inside her. Her panties went damp from how slick her pussy had gotten. She slid her hands around his waist and raked her nails over his back. The material of his shirt kept her from the warm skin she knew lay beneath. The heat of his body engulfed her. She became giddy with the idea of getting him naked. Naked sounded good. Shit, that sounded real good to her. If he continued to flick his tongue over her and curl it around hers like some kind of mating ritual, she might end up coming on the spot. From a kiss. Oxygen pounded its way into her lungs, and still she felt breathless. Her mind ceased to think of anything but sex. All rational thought had been discarded. Pure instinct drove her. This bear had been the first she'd clicked with on so many levels she stopped counting. Being with him felt right, like the most natural thing to do. She ran her hands down to his waist, came around to the front of his jeans, and slid to grasp his erection over the denim. A new, deeper rumble sounded from Kai. She was about to fumble with his belt, when all of a sudden he broke their kiss.
No. Nita. He moaned her name. It was empowering to see him breathing hard and knowing he was just as ready to forget everything as she was. He wanted her too. Mrs. Wilder had clearly made the perfect match with them when it came to chemistry. It was explosive. Her lust-muddled brain wanted sex now. "I should go," he said. The words had the effect of a bucket of ice water. What was she doing? This poor guy had been hurt. Bear shifter or not, she couldn't be throwing herself at him like he was the last chicken wing and she hadn't had dinner. "I don't." He placed a warm, calloused finger over her lips. "This is more than sex." She gulped. Hell yeah. She already knew they weren't going to have everyday type of sex. This was going toward the "I'm gonna fuck you stupid" sex. The hunger in his eyes was there for her to see. His cock was still rubbing over her belly, like he wanted to find his way inside her. She'd gladly show him if need be. But he'd stopped. She should be ecstatic that a man had finally taken it upon himself to look at her as more than a piece of ass. Then why wasn't she? Sexual frustration to the power of almost a year without sex. "Good night, beautiful Nita," Kai said, and took the step separating them from the darkness of the woods. The warmth of his body leaving her had her feeling chilled. "Good night," she whispered. God, she hadn't even brought her vibrator. She was going to sleep all kinds of uncomfortable. His big body slipped into the darkness and was gone in the blink of an eye. She shut the door and took a breath. Well, shit. Talk about something different. Nita had stopped having problems dating the moment she'd embraced her body. At the same time, she'd never really let anyone deep into her heart. All the men in her life had been more short-term flings than deep relationships. Not that she'd really worried about it before. Her cell phone rang at that moment. She ran for the chair she'd placed it on. "Hello?" "So, how was the date?" Tolly exclaimed. "Nita Eilis, how dare you go on a date with some hot bear and not tell me? What did you think I'd do? Judge you or something?" She sighed and sat down with a thump. Time to tell the truth. "It wasn't you. I was just worried this was going to be another dead end in the relationship department. I didn't want you to get your hopes up." "Nita." "Okay," she admitted with a groan, sliding her finger over her still tingling lips. "I didn't want to get my hopes up." Tolly sighed. "I understand. So, how did it go?" "Well," she thought back to the kiss. That part had been damn amazing. "Dinner was great. He's a nice guy that's genuinely sweet. And he's handsome." Tolly snorted with a laugh. "Just handsome?" "Damn it." "Okay, he's hot as hell." "Damn, Tolly, he's so hot my eyes watered." "Wow. He sounds like someone you should bring over for dinner, or at very minimum tie to your bed." She sighed. "Oh, that's not the best part." She thought back to what he'd said before he kissed her. Before he'd kissed her. "He's a romantic, and he kisses like a sex god." Tolly gasped. "Did you already have sex?" "I just met him like 3 hours ago," she exclaimed. "Hey, it's been known to happen." Tolly giggled. Yeah, she was right. And it almost had happened. If Kai hadn't put an end to it, she probably would have gotten naked faster than on a hot summer day with no air conditioning. "He has these gorgeous hazel eyes. They turn this deep green or this golden color when he's talking." Or aroused. She'd seen how dark the green had gotten when he'd kissed her. She wondered what color they would turn when he came. "Ooh, girl, you've never sounded so interested in a man's eyes before."
They reminded her of her old friend's eyes. Kai, except her high school friend's eyes, had never gotten dark green like Kyr's eyes did when he'd been turned on, probably because she'd never seen Kai turned on back when she'd been in school. She'd had a crush on the guy the size of Alaska. Too bad he'd been so shy and she'd been so insecure. The combination had not been good at the time. It had kept her from voicing her thoughts. He's a nice guy. He really was. And that wasn't just her hormones talking him up, so she could feel good about giving it up. Tolly laughed. A nice, hot guy. Just what the doctor ordered for you. More like what Mrs. Wilder got me. She smiled. That old lady was like a matchmaking god. She'd worked her magic on Tolly, and now, if things went according to plan, she might have played her cards right where Nita was concerned. All right. Well, I know this is a series of dates, so you know I will be calling you back tomorrow to find out how that went, Tolly said. Don't you dare ignore my calls, or I swear I'll come hunt you down. Hopefully, she'd have something good to share. Take care. We'll chat tomorrow. She shut off the phone and plugged it in to charge. Then she opted for a nice, long bath. Her apartment was too small to do baths. That and the kitchen were the main reasons she wanted to move. Seeing Kai's gorgeous home only reinforced her need for more space. He lived on so much land. He didn't have annoying neighbors playing loud music in the middle of the night. After a long day of patients screaming at her, the last thing she wanted was to get no sleep because of a noise upstairs or next door. That was the price she paid for living in a busy city. But did she need to stay there? It wasn't like she was broke. If she didn't buy a house in the middle of Midtown, she could afford something further outside of town. The idea flourished. A house with a backyard where she could finally get a dog or cat. Her parents didn't live on the same side of the world anymore. They'd visit wherever she decided to move. So why was she still putting up with the insanity of the city? Sitting in the quiet bath, with nothing but the kisses Kai had given her on her mind, she lost track of time. For the first time in a long time, she didn't have to rush somewhere. It was nice. And the way Kai had treated her had been so different. He could have taken things to the next level right there in the living room with the door wide open. Hell, not only would she have let him, she'd encouraged him to do it. She sat there for a long time. Her thoughts floated over the possibilities that maybe, for once in her life, she could figure out how to have more than just sex with the hot bear. With Kai so nice and sweet, it was easy to talk to him, easy to open up, even when he was just barely awake with a possible concussion. She was a terrible nurse to the big mountain man. Good thing he was a shifter, or he might have died while she drooled over his abs. She should learn to behave when it came to Kai, maybe after she'd seen him fully naked. She snickered as she got out of the bath and dried off. Yeah, right. Like that was gonna happen. She'd keep thinking and visualizing Kai naked until she saw him naked. Then she'd just adjust her visions and keep seeing the right version of him naked in her head. She slipped on a pair of shorts and a tank top. Energy buzzed in her veins. She was still wound up from that kiss. A walk could help her relax and go to sleep. She slipped on her trainers and headed for the creek she'd seen earlier. The brightness from the full moon allowed her to see without the need for a flashlight or her cell phone. A low rumble sounded by the water. She peeked around a tree and gasped. Holy shit! She scurried back behind the tree, hoping that she hadn't been heard or seen. Then she took another look. A giant black bear rubbed his back on a massive trunk. He kicked leaves around and then moved by the edge of the creek, and finally jumped in. Four. Shit! She gasped. Who the heck jumped in the creek? And more importantly, did he know how to swim? Considering she definitely didn't know how, she really hoped the big bear was okay. Gripping the tree bark with her nails, she waited breathlessly until a man emerged from the water. There went her ability to relax for the rest of the night. Kai got out of the water. Kai naked as the day he'd been born. The moonlight reflected off his skin, showing every single wet muscle in high definition. She bit her lip, swallowed hard, and continued to stare. He combed his fingers through his short, spiky hair and stretched his arms above his head. His body gleamed with wetness. He marched away from the water toward the house. Still naked, and so sexy she could do nothing to stop her feet from following behind him. Careful not to make noise, she took her time sauntering after him. He went around the house, to a side entrance that led to his bedroom. A big bed was visible through the glass sliding door. She saw it all clearly from the spot she stood at behind a giant old tree. He didn't bother shutting the door. Her pussy throbbed from intense arousal. He threw some items she couldn't quite make out on his bed. Her curiosity was more than piqued. She wanted him to pick up whatever he'd thrown on the bed so she could see what it was. Then he sat down with some pillows propped behind his back. She watched him press buttons on a TV remote. Still naked, and with a very erect cock, he flicked through channels. She wondered how he'd watch anything in that state. Why was she still standing there, peeping on him like some demented pervert? Because damn it all to hell, he was hot. That, and she liked watching his body. All those muscles, and that slight mat of hair on his chest. He was the complete opposite of every man she'd ever been with. Combine that with the sexual chemistry they had, and she was fascinated. Her gaze zoomed in on his hand. He had squirted something in it. Shit, was that lube? Sure enough, he wrapped his hand around his cock and leaned back into the pillows. Oh no. Oh, this was bad. This was really bad. She should go before he... Too late. She watched, mesmerized, as he jerked his cock with his big hand. He'd stopped watching whatever was on the television. His gaze had strayed to the open door and stayed there. If it weren't so dark, she'd swear he could see her. If she weren't so aroused and needing relief, she might feel bad that she'd intruded in such a private moment. As it was, she started to squirm while standing there. Her harsh breaths pounded loud in her ears. Her clit twitched, needing to be touched. She slid a hand down the inside of her shorts, still focused on Kai. He appeared fixated on her. She rubbed her hand between her legs and bit back a moan. She was wet and desperate to be touched by him. It felt good to touch herself. She knew without a doubt that Kai touching her would feel better than this, but she couldn't ask for that right then. She slipped past her clit and plunged her fingers into her wet center. His handling of his cock turned rougher. He jerked hard, every few strokes rubbing the tip with his thumb. She couldn't see the color of his eyes from where she stood, but she would bet her entire savings they were deep green. He groaned every few minutes. The sound managed to make her wetter. She wanted to run into his room and offer to do the job for him. Just the thought of his cock sliding into her mouth brought an electric tingle to her aching pussy. She pressed a finger into her clit, tweaking the tiny nerve spot hard, tugging the bit of flesh with almost painful speed. With her other hand, she held herself steady by the tree. Her legs started to shake with her fondling of herself. You need to get laid. She lost the battle with her shaky legs and slid down to her knees. Even with her inability to stay upright, she didn't stop. She stared at him, continuing to press at her clit, fingers circling over her pleasure bundle in hard circles. His chest rose and fell, his breathing harsh and labored. She heard his moans and knew it was getting harder for him, the same as it was for her. Her hand rubbed against the material of her shorts, but she didn't care. She gasped, and for a second swore he'd hurt her. God, she was going to get in trouble. There was no stopping at that point. Her hand had a mind of its own. She swooped down, sinking her fingers into her wet heat, coating them with her arousal, and then gliding them over her clit, back and forth. Each slow, wet slide and press tightened the burning in her sex. Meanwhile, Kai's neck veins popped out, showing how close he was getting to losing his control. He pleasured himself with his eyes locked on her. It added gasoline to the fire, raging like a perfect storm in her core. She tapped her clit hard, once, twice. On the third time, she had to bite down on her lip to keep from screaming, and swore she tasted blood. She inhaled sharply, struggling to stop the whimpers riding the back of her throat. Her entire body shook as almost painful pleasure blasted through her. Kai's jerking slowed. He tensed, threw his head back, and roared. The loud sound was coupled with semen spurting from his cock. She had to blink repeatedly to get her vision to refocus. It was moments before he stopped breathing harshly and milking his cock. Then he moved. He stood up and left to an attached bathroom. She took that moment to stand and get the hell away from the house. There had been times in her life she'd done silly things, but never had she ever peeped on a man masturbating, and she sure as hell hadn't started doing it herself while watching him. Not that there was an ounce of remorse in her. She got back to the tiny cabin and locked herself in. No more nighttime walks. Only God knew what else she'd see if she stayed out there. Not to mention, she might beg to join in. That's all she needed, for her date to think she couldn't control her urges. After a really cold shower, she went to bed. Tomorrow would be soon enough to see Kai and decide if things between them were worth pursuing. Kai's morning started out with him in a pissy mood, and way too early for his own good. He'd been unable to sleep thinking about Nita. Jesus Christ. He'd seen her out there, playing with herself at the same time she watched him masturbate. He didn't know what came over him, but he'd loved that he'd turned her on to the point she needed to make herself come. Nita moaning and touching her own body had been better than the video on his TV. He'd been mentally fucking her all night, and when he realized he'd get no sleep, he chose to self-pleasure. But he hadn't expected her, outside his door, moaning and whimpering with one hand between her legs and the other holding the tree next to her. She'd made the most amazing face as she came, her features lost in the pleasure of her orgasm. After he came, he'd gone to the bathroom to clean up, only to return and find her gone. At that point, he was filled with confusion when it came to her. There was one thing that he did know. She wanted him. He shouldn't be surprised that women found him sexually attractive, but seeing Nita's response to him was better than anything. She had been the only woman he'd always wished would be interested in him from the moment he'd laid eyes on her. He grumbled on his way to the kitchen. Liam sat there, smiling, using his pocket knife to sharpen a piece of wood into a sharp point.
"Good morning, Chief."
"What's so good about it?" he snapped. Guilt crept up his neck.
"Sorry, I don't mean to be angry at you. I didn't get much sleep."
Liam's brows rose with interest.
"I didn't think you would, but I don't think it's for the same reason I expected."
To tell Liam about what had happened the previous night was a big no-no in Kai's book. Nita was the woman he'd wanted for much longer than he cared to admit to even himself. He didn't talk about his sex life, or the lack thereof, with anyone. He was private, and he wouldn't go there.
No, it's not what you're thinking.
Definitely not because he'd been balls deep in the woman he'd wanted for more than half his life. No, it was because he hadn't been that. He got no sleep.
Look, I left last night because I thought you two might want to spend some time together.
Liam picked up a piece of toast and took a bite.
But you need to tell me about this injury.
Kai fixed a cup of coffee and spoke.
Someone hit me, hard enough to knock me out, while I was distracted and on the phone.
Liam frowned.
Didn't you send them?
He shook his head.
That's the thing. I think they were hunter's block. I definitely would have scented someone approaching. As it was, I can't figure out how I didn't even hear when they came in.
Liam's snort wasn't surprised.
How could you hear anyone when you leave your doors open so people can come and go as they please?
True. He didn't bother shutting or locking doors during the day. Most of his clan had open access to his cabin. His thoughts drifted back to the previous night. Damn it. Heat spread over his muscles and down to his cock. The image of Nita on her knees, not more than 20 feet from his room, pleasuring herself, still did things to his system no woman ever had. He wanted her. Bad. More than he was willing to admit to her just yet. She didn't realize how special she'd been to him back in high school. They'd been young. His shyness and her friendship had kept him from doing anything bold like kissing her. Most of the time, their interactions turned to fun, friendly activities. It was those activities that allowed his feelings for her to grow, to blossom into an even deeper set of feelings he'd hidden so well she'd never known. Now there she was, just a few 100 yards away from his house, and willing to spend time with him, to see if they could be a perfect match. He already knew they were.
We need to go hunting, then.
Liam broke through his thoughts like a splash of cool water. He was about to agree when Nita knocked at his door. "Good morning." She waved at them. He watched her, searching for any sign of embarrassment over the previous night, but she continued to smile. In fact, her smile widened as her gaze roamed down his body in a visual caress he loved.
Good morning.
Liam lifted his knife in mock salute.
You look great today. Doesn't she look great, Chief?
He realized he'd been standing there, staring at her without speaking. What a frickin' idiot. What happened to his ability to speak to women? It disappeared the moment Nita came back into his life.
You look great,
he said, once he remembered how to use his vocal cords. Thanks. She slid a long curl behind her ear and glanced at the cup in his hand. I would have made coffee in the baby cabin, but I couldn't find any.
Baby cabin?
Liam laughed. She grinned, nodding. It's so cute. It's like a baby cabin. By the way, she entered the kitchen and headed for the table Liam sat at. I appreciate the extra bathroom space and large tub. I worried about getting stuck in a little tub. But you had comfort in mind when you made that. It is probably the biggest part of that cabin. She met his gaze. Aside from the bed. Well, shit. Going back to check out the size of the bed sounded mighty good to him. He knew they'd both fit in it.
Come in and have some coffee,
Kai invited.
Do you mind if we do a walk down by the river with Liam this morning?
She shook her head. Nope, that sounds fun. Guilt burned in his chest.
I know that isn't part of the date, but we have to go check on a few of our clan members, and they're likely to be down by our meeting house.
Yes, it's fine. But something about the way she said the words worried him. It was her dismissive attitude. What changed between the previous night and now? After breakfast, they hiked through the woods toward the river. How far is this river? She panted. her cheeks red from the sun and her hair clinging to the sides of her face with perspiration.
"If you're tired, we can take a break,"
he offered, his guilt growing at the sheen of sweat over her mouth and the tired sigh she gave. "It's just that I'm not used to walking this much." She scrunched her nose. "Okay, I'm not used to walking at all, but I'm happy to continue if you guys slow it down a little." Fuck. What kind of bastard was he that he'd forgotten she was a city girl? He motioned for Liam to keep going ahead of them and handed her the water bottle he had in his pack. He'd packed it just for her, in case she got thirsty. "Thank you," she mumbled, before gulping the water down.
"I'm sorry for the long walk. We're so used to walking and hiking these woods, we forget the trails can be long and difficult for someone that's not from around here."
She groaned and sat down on a patch of grass. "It's okay. I'm so out of shape, it's not even funny. I used to work out a long time ago, but I slacked like a good lazy girl the last few years. My last workout session consisted of me telling my trainer I needed a vacation from exercise." He laughed at the face of pain she made and sat down next to her.
"That must have gone over well."
She shook her head. "He didn't think it was funny in the least. He said to call him when I was ready to get sweaty."
"Have you called him?"
he asked, now fully curious. She raised a brow high. "It takes me almost 4 hours to get my hair to not look like a dry straw broom. I'm no longer interested in getting sweaty with him." Her lips curled in a sexy grin. "There's better ways to mess up my hair and get a workout."
"There most certainly are."
He could count at least 4 that they could try, and probably not mess up her hair much. He especially liked the one workout where she would get on her knees again. She glanced around the quiet forest. "This is so beautiful. So tell me about you. How do you like being a bear shifter chief? I bet that's got to be exciting." He shrugged. He hated talking about himself. He preferred to learn about her and how her life had changed in the past years.
"It has its moments,"
he said, watching the sunlight shine off her gorgeous brown skin. "You know," she squinted out at the distance, leaning slightly into him, "you remind me a lot of someone." His heartbeat tripped in his chest.
"Someone you liked, I hope."
She smiled and turned to face him, the sparkle in her eyes filled with mischief. "Maybe." "Okay, he was a great friend. I actually miss him. Your eyes and your name remind me of him, but you're not like him."
"How am I different?"
"Kai used to have a hard time looking me in the eyes. He also stuttered when we spoke." She sighed. "He was shy. Not that I was much better." He shook his head, remembering the beautiful girl she used to be. Now he was faced with a sexy adult that still managed to make him tongue-tied.
"I find that hard to believe."
She winked. "I was shy. Thankfully, poor Kai never knew the kind of stuff running around my head, or he probably would have killed our friendship." With another of those heart-melting smiles, she leaned toward him some more. "How did we end up back on me? Tell me about your family. Do they live nearby?" He nodded and jumped back to his feet, offering her his hand and helping her stand.
"They do. Only my mother and sister are around now."
He continued to hold her hand as they made their way closer to the river.
"My father passed some years back."
"I'm so sorry."
"It's okay. It was a big fight against some hunters. We had some in our clan giving away private information on our river and winter food stock to a rival clan. They hired hunters, and there was a very big war."
"That's awful," she said, and patted his arm. "Losing family sucks big time." Why did he tell her about his dad? He hated talking about it. His father hadn't been the best father, or even the best husband, but he'd been a damned good leader. He'd held the clan together and devoted himself to ensuring the group prospered. but it was Kai and his financial savvy that had increased their combined portfolios. He'd gotten their land ownership to be twice what it was, and had doubled the savings of every clan member. Still, telling her about his father was big even for him. He'd held his father's death locked away, never talking about it. The pain from the loss of his father and the difficult relationship they'd had continued to burn bright in his chest. Anger and hurt had raged deep inside him for so long, he'd forgotten how to live without them. If only the old bear hadn't been so insistent on going to face the enemy alone. If only he'd listened to Kai and waited for some enforcers. But no, he'd taken it upon himself to face the hunters and the rival clan. He'd ended up dead. With every step they took closer to the river, he pulled her closer to his side, until she was held by him in a one-arm hug. "So why did your sister decide to find you a date?" Her voice broke the quiet walk. He'd known it was coming. How to explain that Jess was tired of hearing about what was wrong with every female that wanted to have a relationship with him? He'd been okay with dinner and sex in most cases, but long-lasting? Not even as a joke. She'd given him grief over his lack of trying to find a woman to bear his cubs and help with the clan. "She feels it's time I made a commitment to someone and stuck with her." She stopped in her tracks. He glanced at her, noticing the frown lines and curious stare. "What do you think? I mean, what she feels is great and all, but she's not the one that's going to be in a relationship. You are." He took a step toward her, stopping right in front of her. She glanced up, not breaking their gaze. "What does Kai want?" Kai. He wanted Nita. He wanted her for so long, he'd refused to give it too much thought, for fear of how it would look that a grown man had been wanting the same woman for almost 17 years. He'd pretty much erased the word relationship out of his brain, because there was no Nita in his life. "I agree with her." He lifted a hand and caressed her smooth cheek. "I want someone who wants to be in a relationship. I want to create something long-lasting with a woman who wants more than just sex." She visibly gulped. "Sex is good, though." He leaned closer, her scent digging deep, waking the raging lust he couldn't seem to stop for her. Even the bear roared for a taste. "Sex is real good." Her pupils dilated as she glanced at his mouth. "Sex with a person you're attracted to is probably better." "True. Someone who can make your blood run hot and give you all sorts of dirty thoughts." She inhaled sharply and met his gaze. "How dirty is dirty?" He moved closer still, until he was but a few millimeters away from her lips. "Oh, dirty. So dirty you'll never be clean again." She gasped. "I think I want to meet that someone." "You already have, beautiful." He pulled her into his arms and meshed their lips in a kiss so hot he couldn't stop the roar at the back of his throat. The bear wanted in on the action, too. She wrapped her hands around his neck and clung tight to him. He pushed her back against a large tree. Her soft body rubbed over his in mind-blowing caresses. He slid his hands up from her waist to cup her breasts. Fuck, he'd been dying to touch them. Those tops she wore that played peekaboo and drove him insane for the past hours were killers. Grabbing handfuls of her large tits, he cupped her and squeezed. Jesus fucking hell, she was hot. Those sexy moaning sounds she made as he slid his thumbs over her hard little nipples turned his cock steel hard. If that weren't painful enough, she raked her nails on the back of his neck, digging them deep. The stinging added another dimension to the arousal raging in his blood. Rational thought fled his brain. His sole focus became those moans, those whimpers in their kiss. The way she curled her tongue over his in a way no woman ever had before. He rocked his pelvis into her belly. How he wanted inside her, fucking her, feeling her pussy clench around him.
"Chief, you guys okay?"
Liam called from down the path.
"Fucking hell,"
he huffed.
"Yes, we're fine. We'll be there in a sec."
He glanced into Nita's smiling eyes. Looks like we need to find a better time for the chemistry quiz portion of our date.
There is no quiz. We both know where this is going.
He knew he pushed it, laying it out right like that. But fuck it all. He was hard, and he wouldn't be getting any relief anytime soon. You're right. She slid her hands from around his neck, slowly down his chest, stopping at his abs. We both know where this is going. The question is, your bed or mine? Hell yes. He grinned.
Who says we'll make it to the bed?
Five. Nita had to count to 10 backward and forward before she did something she'd never done and attacked a man. It didn't matter that he was taller, bigger, and tougher. That scruffy beard, those sexy hazel eyes, and that gorgeous smile was going to push her to a new level of desperate. She'd claimed that her cousin Tolly was the one who needed to get laid, but clearly she was past due in the sex department. The last time she'd had sex had been so long ago, her vagina probably had a vacancy sign with full-blown neon lights down there. She'd slowed down on the dating in search of something different. A man who would be more than just sex. She hated lies. Somehow most of the relationships she'd been in involved her boyfriends keeping things from her, and her finding out later on. She was tired of it. She wanted honesty. She wanted everything out in the open. So far, Kai had shown her he was the real deal. More than just sex. So why then did this man that made her want more than sex also make her think of the naughtiest things? It wasn't fair. She'd never been so ready to drop her panties and spread 'em like she was at that moment. Sadly, she didn't even feel an ounce of shame over it. What she did feel was anger that Liam had interrupted their kiss. The rest of the walk to the river was quiet, with Kai holding her hand the entire way. It was new and different. Men she dated in the past hadn't done things like help her walk so she wouldn't fall. They hadn't held her hand just because they wanted to, and they certainly hadn't waited to push their way into her bed. Those men had been takers. Clearly Kai was a giver. Now if she could only get him to give her all the orgasms that wicked smile of his promised. The river bend was beautiful. There was a waterfall and some large rocks that allowed for prime viewing of the lower valley. She'd bet watching the sunset from there would be unforgettable. The lush greenery and giant trees only reminded her of how little she had in way of a view back home. This openness called to her. She'd give up the city so fast if she found a house in the woods. Not that she was a fan of living alone, but maybe in time she'd find the man for her. Someone like the bear. She really liked where this was going with him. Her mind told her to take her time with him, but her body, that desperate bitch, told her to get him naked as soon as possible. Jesus, the bear naked. Those heavy muscles she'd felt under that plaid shirt might kill her from pleasure. If she could just lick her way up his jaw, she might come without any actual sex. The way he kissed her alone disabled her ability to think.
"This is where we do most of our fishing,"
Liam said, pointing to the large river. Oops. She'd blacked out the conversation while visualizing him and her doing naughty stuff. The big fall that scurried down to the giant river below showed her a clear view of the fish as they traveled down and up the current. Wow, I've never been fishing, but I'm getting the urge to. Look at all those fish, she exclaimed.
Kai nodded. We have prime location here. It's been a big problem with nearby clans that want to fish without permission.
So you won't let anyone else fish here? She allowed him to help her further down the side of the river, toward the group of cabins below.
We do if they ask permission. We don't want to overfish, so we have seasons. The problem is, some of the other clans don't want to fish at the other rivers that are further away. They want to claim this one for themselves. It becomes a big problem when they start trouble with my people.
Does that happen often? She trailed next to him, following behind Liam. Liam stopped some yards ahead of them.
We have a problem, Chief.
They reached the spot where Liam stopped. There was a pile of empty beer bottles and trash.
It has to be the Greenfield clan, Kai growled. Heck, it could even be one of the clans from further away.
Who are the Greenfields? She asked, glancing at the large mess they'd left behind. Liam pulled out a cell phone and sent a text.
They're our closest neighbors. I've asked Oliver and Caleb to help clean this up.
And they are? She asked again, feeling all kinds of lost from lack of information.
2 of our guards, Kai replied. They'll come take care of making sure this place is cleaned up.
At that moment, the sound of breaking leaves and someone approaching from the right side of the forest stopped the conversation. A man almost as tall as Kai, with curly brown hair and a beard long enough to nest a family of pigeons, approached them.
Hey there, Chief. Hi, David.
Liam and Kai greeted at the same time.
Ma'am.
He nodded toward Nita. Hi. She waved.
David, this is Nita. She's staying with me.
Kai introduced them.
Nita, this is David Marsh. He's one of the guards in the clan.
She hadn't been called a ma'am before. It was official. She was old. She wasn't bothered, though. David probably called every woman ma'am. His beard was bigger than his face. It was thick and full, and there was a leaf or 2 stuck to it. She'd never been so tempted to check a man for small animals in his facial hair. She bet her car keys could hide in there and never be found.
There's no dead animals in there,
David said, as though reading her mind. Sorry. She'd been caught staring. A flush of guilt crept up her neck. David smiled, though most of his face was covered in hair. She just knew there was a handsome guy under there.
It's okay. I do shave when the occasion calls for it, but with winter coming, it's easier to leave it as is.
Probably not smart to tell him it was only the end of summer, and fall still hadn't come. If he kept his beard growing, he'd end up with a blanket for winter.
David, can you see if you can find out from some of the others what happened here?
David gave a sharp nod.
You got it, Chief.
She held on to Kai and watched David turn to leave.
Was nice meeting you, ma'am.
She could almost tell he was smiling that time. She waved at David. Nice meeting you too. What will you do about the neighbors? She asked, turning to face the hill again.
Liam will go chat with them.
He frowned, holding on tighter when she slipped on a rock.
Let's go back. It's lunchtime.
She glanced over her shoulder when he said that. She thought Liam was at their back. He was already several yards away from them. Nice seeing you, Liam, she yelled. Liam smiled, waved, and turned back to the trail. Going up the hill wasn't as easy as going down. She ended up depending on Kai, and almost allowed him to help her most of the way up. When they reached his cabin, the smell of food overpowered her. She didn't realize how long their walk had been until her stomach growled. Kai smiled at her.
We'll feed you now.
She would have been embarrassed, except that whatever was being cooked smelled divine. Rays of sunlight highlighted the cabin in the woods, giving it an almost fairy tale look. It was like looking at a painting. Even the birds decided to chirp at that moment. Seemed like nature was trying to tell her to move her ass out of the city. She'd not had a single allergic reaction or need for any of the meds she'd brought in case of poison ivy, poison oak, allergies, mosquitoes, or any other kind of bug bite. She rocked. A short, curvy blonde woman, with her hair in a long braid down her back, and a crop top and shorts, moved around the kitchen with ease. She stopped suddenly and turned to them, a wide smile covering her lips. "Hi, I'm Jess." She rushed forward and enveloped Nita in a tight hug. "You're Nita. I feel like I've known you forever." "Thanks, that's so nice." Weird, but nice. She glanced at the bear, but he was busy frowning at Jess.
"Do you mind if I leave you both alone for a few minutes?" he asked. "I need to make a few calls to make sure Liam's all right and doesn't encounter any resistance at the Greenfield place."
"Go," Jess urged. "I'll keep Nita company."
"Jess."
"I'll behave." She grinned. Some sort of nonverbal communication seemed to go on, because after a few silent moments, he sighed and left the room. "Won't you please sit, Nita? Tell me, how do you like it up here?" Nita had to smile. The other woman's grin and energy was infectious. "I think it's beautiful. I'm actually tired of living in the city. My place is too small. I'm wanting to get some flowers, a backyard, maybe a dog." Jess's brows flew up. "Like a pet?"
Was there another kind?"
"Yes, I love furry little creatures."
Jess burst into giggles.
"I am so sorry." She laughed. "You must think I'm crazy, but up here, we don't see many dogs. You know, the whole bear growly thing."
"Oh." That made sense. Sort of.
"No wonder it's so quiet." Jess snorted, standing to open lids on pots over the stove. "Stick around here when one of these guys is angry. Trust me, it is anything but quiet." "It's very nice up here, though. So open and green," she murmured, the idea of a place outside the city rooted in her brain. "Winter can be harsh," Jess said, picking up a glass of ice water and taking a sip. "But if you have a cuddly someone to keep you warm, then it isn't so bad." She winked. "I bet." A nice big bear with lots of body heat to help keep her warm sounded really good.
"Jess, Mom would like for you to help Mrs. Roberts go back to her cabin," Kai said from the other room.
"Darn it," Jess sighed. She turned off the heat on the pots and glanced at Nita. "The food is ready. Today's special is baked salmon and vegetables for lunch and beef stew for dinner. The salad is in the fridge."
"Wow, talk about multitasking."
"You really didn't have to." She raised a hand and stopped Nita. "I did. You do not want to be eating PB&J all day today, and then tomorrow, too. It's sweet that he tries, but it gets old real soon. I had to endure a week of it when I got sick once, and Mom and Dad were traveling. Suffice it to say, I am no longer a fan." Nita was caught off guard by Jess's impromptu hug as she headed out the door. "It's been lovely meeting you, Nita. We'll have to catch up before you go home." "Absolutely. Thanks so much for the food." She waved goodbye. Jess made her feel so at home, as if she were part of the family. Other than Tolly, Nita didn't have real close friends. It was nice to meet another woman who didn't appear to be a psychotic bitch. With Nita's luck, they always started out friendly enough and ended up blaming her for their bad decisions in life. It's why she didn't have many friends. It was why she only spoke to Tolly about her life. She closed the kitchen door and locked it. Then she headed for the sound of Kyre's voice. Gliding her hand over beautiful carved wooden eagles, bears, and foxes, she marveled at the craftsmanship. Someone had taken a long time to create those decorative pieces. A smile crept over her lips as she listened to his voice grow closer.
"No, We will not back down and let it go. Tell them if we catch one of them on our land, there's not going to be calling the sheriff next time."
Something about a man being so commanding and aggressive shot a spark of lust down her spine. She was such a sick freak. God, all she needed to do was get on all fours now and ask the big bear to spank her. Or even better, lick her honey. She bit back a laugh. "Ha! You need therapy. And sex, too." She reached the massive office and stood there at first, watching him face the large wall of glass, showing a beautiful view of the woods. His big shoulders tensed. Then he pressed a button on the cell phone.
"Selfish assholes,"
he barked, and turned to face her. "Want to talk about it?" Where the hell had that come from? She didn't like talking about her own problems, and there she was, genuinely interested in whatever was frustrating the sexy bear. She'd prefer to see him smiling again, instead of frowning. She couldn't stop herself from strolling right to him. It was as though her body had a mind of its own. She wanted near him, closer. She stopped a foot away, watching his chest rise and fall with every breath. "Your sister left," she said. Still, he said nothing. The way his gaze focused on her mouth, dropping to her breasts, and then sliding down the rest of her body, almost started a brush fire in her veins. "The food is ready." She tried again, watching him lick his lips, his gaze stuck on her chest. If only he'd do something. Anything. She was so close to tearing at his clothes, it wasn't funny. "Are you hungry?"
"Starved,"
he finally replied. "Oh, well, good. What are you in the mood for? There's 2 different options on the stove. One's a beef and the other a fish. I don't have a preference." He closed the single step between them and grabbed her arms.
"I'm not hungry for food."
"Thank you, God." She swallowed hard at the dryness in her throat. "Whatever you're in the mood for, take it." If he needed more than that, then he wasn't as intuitive as she thought. She was pretty much offering herself to him for the taking. She held her breath and waited, and watched him. The deep frown lines lifted, and his features changed into a sinful smile.
"Oh, I'm taking it. All of it."
She didn't get a chance to reply. He dropped his head and licked their lips together. The kiss, dear God, what a kiss, was better than any of the previous ones. This was full of hunger, passion, demand. It was as if the animal side of him had taken control. She loved it, the way with which he slid his hand down her arms to the edge of her shirt, the warmth of his hands when he pulled the material up and above her head. Their kiss broke for all of a second before their lips were once again pressed together, tongues rubbing and breaths mingling. She gripped his shirt in her hands, the material soft yet annoying. There was too much between her hands and his body. She wanted it all out of the way. She tugged on his shirt until he got the hint and the thing came off. A sigh fell from her lips at the feel of his warm, smooth skin. Blazing need pulled at her core. Her body vibrated with desire for Kai. This thirst for his touch, it was unlike anything she'd ever experienced before. Somehow, some way, he'd managed to reach deeper in a few hours than other men had in the span of months. She didn't know if it was his genuine interest in her and what she said. All she knew was that she wanted him more than she'd ever wanted anyone. It was new and almost scary to want him with every fiber of her being. Bone-deep desire for the man sliding his hands up her back and removing her bra grew with each of her breaths. His abs contracted under her palms. She glided her hands up his chest, through the slight mat of hair, and scored her nails down his pecs. A loud, hoarse groan sounded from him. He broke their kiss, eyes bright with a hunger she loved seeing in their depths. Her bra came off, and his gaze slowly trailed down to her tits. "You are by far the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." She couldn't say if it was the way he said the words, with so much honesty, but hearing him say it and watching his expression fill with lust broke her control. "Touch me, please," she begged in a soft cry. "I can do better than touching," he murmured. "I can lick, suck, and fuck you for the rest of my life. Your body is an addiction I never want to give up." He yanked on the button to her shorts, pulling them and her panties down her legs. He didn't give her a chance to enjoy the heated smile over his lips. He tied her to a big brown sofa against the wall. The back of her legs hit the sofa, and she fell on the cushion. She tugged on the fly of his jeans. The pants fell down his legs, and that's when she realized he went commando. Hot damn. "My," she gasped. Breaths rushed out of her lungs while she tried to take in the entire vision of his body, his very big body with those really mind-muddling muscles. He was way past sexy and into hot damn of body categories. With his slightly hairy chest, legs, and arms, he made her fantasize while being wide awake. Then there was his cock, large, stiff, and with beads of pre-cum dripping from the slit. Her throat went dry with every peek she took at his shaft. To make things more interesting, she'd swear the more she looked at it, the harder and bigger it got. "Touch me, Nita," he whispered. She raised a hand to touch him, stroking the hot, hard length of him. She grasped him tight in her hand, moving her hand up and down his shaft. Once she got to the tip, she wet her thumb with the moisture dripping from his slit and rubbed it over the head of his cock. She moved closer, ready to take him in her mouth, but he grabbed her face in his hands, forcing her to look up at him. He shook his head and dropped down to his knees, moving his hands to her thighs, pushing her legs wide open. "Not yet, beautiful," he said in a low, gruff whisper. "I need to taste you before I lose my control." His features tightened with need. A large brown fuzz of fur had grown over his sideburns. She couldn't have liked the view more. He was losing control over her. Not some other woman. Nita, a primitive need to lose her own control along with him, pushed her to act. She slid her fingers into his hair, gripping and tugging him up to her. A new clash of their lips, and she was on fire. He cupped her breasts, thumbing her nipples roughly. The ache in her pussy grew by leaps and bounds. She wanted him to fill her with his cock. She needed to be his. She tugged her face to the side, breaking their kiss and moaning. "Please." Dear God, if she didn't get him inside her soon, she might explode. He slid his lips down her jaw, biting, kissing, licking. Wetness dripped from her pussy. She was soaked. He sucked a nipple into his mouth, and fireworks went off behind her lids. "Yes, keep doing that. I like your mouth on my tits." The roughness of his beard, combined with the painful bite from his teeth, shot electric currents from her nipples to her clit. Intense arousal shook her to the core. He squeezed her tits together, licking and sucking from one nipple to the other. The delightful torture only intensified her desperation. "For the love of sanity, fuck me, please." She sucked in breaths, trying to keep her brain in working order, but the reality was she was so far gone, nothing could help. Nothing but his body taking hers, owning hers. "Kai, I need more," she groaned. He lifted his head from her breast, her nipples still in his mouth, and let go with a resounding pop. "Your skin tastes so fucking good, like hot sex and whipped cream." He kissed the valley of her breasts and ran circles with his tongue down her belly. At the juncture of her thighs, he pushed her legs open and stared at her pussy. He inhaled and groaned. "Your pussy smells like the sweetest honey." He licked his lips. "Bears like honey, and I think I will love eating your pussy and tasting that sweetness glistening on your pretty pink lips." With other men, her instinct would have been to suck her belly in and try not to notice the bump that she had. Not so with him. She was very aware of her body. She was a big girl, and she'd accepted long ago she was not going to be any smaller. Heck, she'd embraced her curves and had come to love them. But that tiny niggling doubt tried to push its way forward to bring up the insecurity she'd fought so hard and won years back. Kai caressed her inner thigh, heating her to the core with his penetrating stare. "You're beautiful, Nita. Every single inch of you makes my mouth water. Don't hide from me." It was as though he'd looked inside her mind and knew that small, niggling insecurity had tried to worm out of the hole she'd shoved it in. His words had brought back the security she had in her body. She was hot. She wasn't tiny, but she was hot, and she knew he wanted her. From the tight lines of his face, from the way he licked his lips and inhaled. More importantly, from the hard cock she touched earlier. "I want you. I want to fuck you in every way possible." He said the words as a promise. "I want to slide so deep in you, there will be nothing between us. I want my cock in your ass, fucking that dark hole, too." "Kai," she called to him in a soft whimper. "Please." His head dropped between her legs. He treated her large thighs with such gentleness, spreading them wider and displaying her for his view. His breath caressed her pussy. He curled his arms around her thighs, and she ended up with her legs over his big shoulders. "How badly do you want me to lick your pussy, darling?" His words taunted her. "I want it so bad, more than anything," she whimpered. "Do you want me to flick my tongue on your clit or suck on it?" "Suck it, lick it, and bite it. Do it all. I don't care. Just do something before I die waiting to come." She groaned, tilting her hips, trying to reach his lips. She needed that touch, his mouth on her twitching clit. Her muscles burned with need. Right when she thought she couldn't possibly survive another second without his touch, his lips grazed her pussy in a kiss so light she moaned at the torture. "You're so evil." He chuckled. The laughter caused his shoulders and her legs to shake with the movement. "Baby." He kissed the hard nubbin of her desire. "You have no idea how good I can be." She gripped his short hair in her fists. "I don't want to hear how good you are," she panted. "Show me." He licked her pussy again, harder, rougher. He splayed his tongue flat and swiped it up from ass to clit in a blood-boiling lick meant to reduce her brain cells to jelly. "Oh, my God." There was no stopping her whimpers any longer, nor the wiggling of her hips as he rolled his tongue over her clit, then down to her entrance, sucking at her sleek core, making slurping noises she was even more turned on by. A loud rumble sounded from his chest as he fucked her pussy with his tongue. She pushed back into the sofa, her muscles almost locking from the quick rise to the edge. The delicious torture didn't stop there. He slid a finger into her, hooking it and rubbing her insides at the same time he sucked on her clit. She didn't get a single warning. The winding tension at her core snapped to the point she was shoved into the wild waves of pleasure. She screamed louder than she ever had. A call for Kai tore from her throat. The orgasm pushed to the forefront, taking her breath away. An explosion of desire washed over her tense muscles, cooling her sizzling pores. Her legs shook on his shoulders. It was unlike any other experience. No man had ever made her body's need for him scorch her from the inside. There had never been an orgasm that left her spent. Her body ached, as though she'd run miles and worked out like she hadn't in years. Christ! She blinked her vision back into focus and watched Kai slide his cheek on her thigh. Then he kissed her and repeated it with her other thigh. She leaned forward, cupping his face in her hands and kissing him, enjoying the taste of her own body on his lips. With a gentle push, she got him to lay back on the carpet. Six. She straddled him, stroking her slick pussy over his cock in a slow glide. Fuck, he groaned. He grabbed her tits and fondled her, tweaking her nipples with his calloused thumbs. She curved into his touch, moving her body forward. Oh, yes, do that. I like when you tug on my nipples, she moaned, need burning tight in her chest. He did it again. Sweetheart, you need to let me in you, or I will embarrass myself if you keep sliding yourself on my dick. She lifted her hips and grabbed his slick cock with one hand to place it at the entrance of her sex. He pulsed in her hand, hard and hot. She met his gaze. A world of communication happened without either saying a word. Then she pressed down. For every inch she slid down, her lungs burned hotter. She dug her nails into the mat of hair on his chest, using him for leverage. Oh, God. He slid his hands down from tweaking her nipples to hold her by the waist. I'm sorry, darling. He bit out through his clenched jaw. Why? She asked with a gasp. The feeling of being stretched overpowered her senses. I can't do slow any longer, he growled. All of a sudden, the world shifted. She was on her back, with Kai pumping deep into her from above. She gasped as she pressed his cock further and further, until she could swear there wasn't a single inch of space in her he couldn't reach. He groaned. Fuck, you feel so good. Brushing his lips on the side of her neck, he pulled back. The quick thrust that followed tore a moan from her. She gripped his slick arms, digging her nails in an unforgiving bite. He licked her shoulder, grazing his teeth over her hot skin. Yes, she encouraged. More. Do me harder. Fuck, sweetheart. You're so tight I'm having a hard time controlling myself. Control? What control? She'd given up on control a long time ago. I think, she panted, the better words are, you're goddamned huge. He stopped inside her and laughed, the sound reverberating between them. You're really good for my ego. She wasn't exaggerating either. He really was the biggest she'd ever had, and that spoke volumes since, not that she was easy or anything, she'd been with her fair share of men. Bear Man had it going on in size, depth, and stroke. He thrust and propelled back. Deeper, harder, faster. The sliding of his body over hers turned into a reminder of how delectable it was to have him filling her, taking her. Breaths puffed out of her lips in short, quick bursts. He lowered his head and kissed her, skating his tongue over her lips, in and out of her mouth in tandem with each plunge of his cock into her. Hunger expanded in her chest, almost to near bursting. A new craving had taken over her body. She needed to come, had to have him make her reach that peak she rarely got to go with a man. Almost as if he'd read her mind, his drives turned harsher, animalistic. A rumble sounded from his chest. His bear was close to the surface, and that only made him wilder. Lust raged inside her, blacking out everything but him. His body pressed her to the rug. He skimmed his hands up to her face to hold her head at the angle he wanted for his kisses. A storm brewed in her blood. Then came that moment where her muscles tightened. She broke their kiss, searching for much-needed air. "Oh, Kai," she choked. He nibbled on her jaw and earlobe. "Come, your body's ready, and I want to feel your pussy tight on my cock." She couldn't breathe or think or do more than feel the tension snap and a flood of pleasure assault her. A loud moan rushed up her throat and left her dry lips. Stars burst in the back of her lids. The world slowed to a crawl where only the sound of her heartbeats filled her ears. His thrust slowed. His body tensed above hers. Their gazes met. An inexplicable connection she'd felt there the moment he opened his eyes grew between them. He threw his head back and roared at the same time his cock pulsed inside her. Streams of cum filled her channel with his seed. He rolled them over, still inside her, until she lay on top of him again. They stayed that way for what felt like hours, but was probably more like a few minutes, trying to catch their breaths. "I have an idea," Kai said, his voice rough and deep. She didn't have the energy to say actual words. Heck, just thinking of moving away from her giant muscle man bed made her wince. "Want to go to a bed?" He kissed her forehead. The brush of his lips on her sweaty skin felt wonderful. He stroked his hands down her back, to her ass, and then back up again. It was a sensual embrace that stirred her desire for him anew. He chuckled. "What about some food? I'm starving." "Feed me, sexy bear." He cupped her head, tugging it up to look into her eyes with a smile that melted any brain cells she had left. "I'll do more than feed you, beautiful. I'll take care of you." Her heart flipped in her chest at the real concern she saw in his gaze. Maybe sex so quickly wouldn't mess up their budding relationship. Like she could keep her hands off him now. Sex with Kai had been the best decision she'd made, aside from getting Mrs. Wilder to hook her up. Being with the bear had been like winning the sexual lottery. Not only had he rocked her world with his tongue, but he had a cock to match. All her life, she'd wanted a man that could give her attention, great sex, and was not an asshole. It only took getting hooked up with a different species to get what she wanted. She already knew that she wanted more with her bear. Kai brought a tray of snacks to the table and chairs he'd set up by the creek behind his house. It was early still, and he knew he'd have to go deal with some of his clan problems later. Much later. Right now he was focused on the curvy woman bending over in the water. Nita dipped into the water, flashing her ass as she did. The royal blue two-piece bikini did nothing to hide the luscious body she had. Or her ass. And what an ass that was. She was more than he could have ever imagined she'd be as an adult. Sexy, funny, but with a sensuality she probably didn't even know she possessed. Their years apart had been good to her. She wasn't the shy girl with body issues she used to be. He'd never understood it. Her curves seemed pretty damn perfect to him. Then again, he loved him a woman with some ass to grab and hips to grip, not to mention her breasts. He glanced down at his erection and shook his head. The semi-aroused state he'd been in since opening his eyes and finding Nita in his kitchen had not gone away. If his intentions weren't to keep her as his mate, he might have felt like a pervert. She looked up and smiled. That smile of hers reached into his chest and warmed his heart. He waved her over to the table he'd set up with snacks for them. She'd always loved fruit. His sister had made a point of stocking his fridge with all of Nita's favorites. He had no idea how she'd found out, but he was grateful for Jess. He wore his black framed glasses now. She'd already seen them, but had gotten him to promise he'd wear them the next time they had sex. She'd said he looked really sexy wearing them. "Hey, that looks awesome," she said, rushing over and picking up a towel.
"Are you cold?"
"A little. It's not as warm as it should be in order to be getting into that creek." She snuggled into the towel. He frowned when she bounced on her heels, trying to warm herself up. Instinctively, he wrapped his arms around her, rubbing up and down her sides to warm her up. She glanced up, her eyes filled with an openness she hadn't noticed before. "Thank you," she said, her voice low and seductive. There was something else there, more than just need or lust. He couldn't define it, but he liked it. Thump. The sound of something hitting the ground broke the moment. He glanced around and noticed a branch rolling off his wood shed. She cleared her throat and sat down, grabbing a plate and piling it up with fruit. "This reminds me of the whole cabin in the woods from scary movies." He chuckled and sat across from her, watching her take bites of watermelon and strawberry.
"It's really not that scary up here. In the dead of winter, I put up some floodlights around the pathways for anyone that might get lost."
She shook her head and scrunched her nose. "I don't know if I could be walking around here unless there was some form of brightness to ease my fear of the dark."
"You're afraid of the dark?"
He blinked, trying not to show the surprise he felt. That was something he'd never known about her. She shrugged. He sensed her unease. She wrapped the towel tighter around her shoulders. Her gaze dropped down to her plate. "Yeah, it's something from when I was a kid." The way she hesitated brought out his curiosity. That was an action that the younger Nita would have done. The woman he'd seen so far didn't have that insecurity, so it worried him that whatever caused her fear was still present in her life.
"What happened?"
A loose tendril of her hair dropped from her ponytail and floated over her shoulder. With the sunlight showcasing her beautiful caramel skin, he had no problem sitting there and staring at her for hours. "Not much. Just kids. Kids can be mean." She sighed. He knew that. He'd been picked on as a kid for being slim compared to the other kids in the clan. Even his father had picked on him. To add insult to injury, his need to wear glasses and braces made the comments hurtful and cruel. He'd never told anyone, though, not even his wonderful mother and sister. He learned to tell himself that he wouldn't always be the little guy, that one day he'd grow up and be able to defend himself against bullies. That day was his 18th birthday. It seemed puberty hit him overnight. Muscles had filled out his once puny arms. The braces had gone, and women were noticing him in a new light. Even his father had stopped speaking to him like a weakling and started addressing him like the future clan leader.
"What does that have to do with you being afraid of the dark?"
She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "When I was 12, some girls invited me to a sleepover party. I thought they wanted to be friends." Shadows crossed her features. Pain. Sadness. "I never did anything with anyone other than Tolly, my cousin, so this was something new." She cleared her throat and glanced up, away from him into the distance. "Anyway, They asked me to get something in one of the closets and closed the door behind me, locking me in.
He knew she was reliving the nightmare with the way her breaths quickened and how fast she rushed the words out. She picked up a glass of iced tea and took a sip. Her hand shook, bringing the glass back to the table. He didn't want to say anything to sound like he was pitying her, but he knew all too well how difficult being mistreated by other children could feel. What happened then?
She gave a dry laugh. Not much. I pounded on the door, kicked, screamed, and cried. I could hear them calling me all kinds of names because of my weight.
She licked her lips, pursing them before going on.
Eventually, one of the parents showed up to check on us, noticed I wasn't there, and made the girls tell them where I was.
Jesus. His chest throbbed from the pressure of holding back the urge to roar, to stomp around and knock down a few trees. Knowing she'd been through something like that increased his urge to hold her and make things that much better for her.
It's okay,
she said, obviously reading his features.
I'm not fond of small spaces either, but the dark is what gets me.
He'd light up that forest like a fucking Christmas tree if it made her feel better. His bear huffed inside. Neither liked the idea of Nita being afraid.
What about you? Are you scared of anything?
She asked, the dark shadows leaving her eyes. Does my own cooking count? She burst into laughter. The sound soothed his agitated bear.
No, but I will admit that I'm not the best cook either. Don't feel too bad. I usually eat out.
She picked up a piece of strawberry and took a tiny bite. The juice coated her lips. Animal instinct told him to lick it off her lips, but he fought it. They'd done a lot more than kiss for the past few hours. He could control himself. He would control himself, even if it gave him blue balls.
Tell me one of your biggest pet peeves, she said suddenly.
I guess women who try to be something they're not. I don't want the perfect woman. I just want someone who is comfortable in her own skin. Someone who wants to genuinely be with me. No drama, no bullshit. He knew what he wanted. Her. Your turn. Biggest pet peeve. She bit her lip in thought. Uh-oh. Are you one of those that have a laundry list of things you dislike? He joked. She laughed.
Now I might not tell you.
Come on, I was kidding. He grinned. You gotta admit, you took long enough to worry me.
You are so bad. So, pet peeve. I guess if I had to pick, my biggest pet peeve is liars. I try to be honest at all times about everything with people, especially in a relationship. I hate it when men say one thing, and then I find out they have 5 other women they're dating and a handful of baby mamas. She raised her brows. Do you have any baby mamas you need to tell me about? He almost fell out of his chair laughing. No, he chortled. No baby mamas here. I'm keeping my need to have babies locked away until I get a mate. Good man. Waiting for marriage. I hope you're not expecting a ring after last night. She flirted, her gaze dropping down to his lips. I mean, you need to show me more skills before I can decide on something so important. You need more skills? Will my genius math skills help? Are you? She asked. Laughter sparkled in the depth of her eyes. Are you a genius? When I was a kid, most others thought I was too smart for my own good. Smart and scrawny. Her eyes widened, and she blinked, her jaw hanging open. Were you a geek? You don't need to sound so surprised. He twisted his lips in a wry smile. I'm not all brawn and no brains. She swiped her tongue over her bottom lip, licking the juice from the strawberries. Talk about torture in the first degree. Oh, I know you're more than just brawn. It takes some serious smart to do some of the stuff you did with your tongue. She winked. Heat crowded his cheeks. She made him blush. That was a new one. He hadn't blushed in almost 15 years. That's it.
I won't say anything else or you'll definitely peg me a geek."
She laughed, the sound sweet music to his ears. "It can't be that bad." He folded his arms over his chest, enjoying the way she stared at him. She couldn't have denied she wanted him. It was clear for him to see and scent.
"Yes, it can."
"What's your favorite movie?"
"Star Trek. The original, not that remake crap they have."
Her mouth formed into a surprised "oh."
"I told you."
She waved her hand. "A lot of people like that. That doesn't make you a geek." Wind tossed loose tendrils of her hair around her shoulders. He loved the sight of her skin shining from the sun and water. The bronze color glowed in the light.
"All right, suit yourself."
He knew he was treading on dangerous ground. She might figure out who he was if he kept talking about his past. He might look different, but the things he'd enjoyed as a teen were the same he liked as an adult. She leaned forward and tapped the table. "What's your favorite TV show?"
"Doctor Who."
She frowned. "Who?"
"Yeah."
"What?"
"Doctor Who."
"I don't understand." She pouted her lips prettily. "Who's Doctor?" He barked a laugh. She was a riot and didn't even realize it.
"It's a TV show. The name of the show is Doctor Who. It is also the name of the main character. Sorry if I confused you."
"Oh," she said, still sounding puzzled. "Okay, I'll admit that one threw me off."
"I told you so."
"Whatever." She rolled her eyes. "It's not like you have boxes of mint-condition comic books in your room and some plastic gloves to read them with." He must have given himself away because she gasped. "Busted." "You do have comic books." Her voice was filled with awe. "Are they in little plastic baggies?"
"No."
He snorted, as if that were some sort of crime.
"I have them in a clear enclosure to display them without getting dusty. In my guest room."
Yeah, that made him sound so much less the geek. She stood up and strolled around the table to his side, only to sit on his lap, curling her hands around his neck. "You know what? I think you're sexy whether you read comic books, go to Comic-Con, or watch reruns of the original Star Trek." He held her by the waist, pressing her closer.
"You don't think being a geek is stupid?"
She leaned forward and brushed her lips over his. "I think, Mr. Geek, you are the hottest geek I've ever met." He'd never been told that before. Usually when women found out his entertainment preferences and the fact that he analyzed everything, they tended to pull away. If they found out about his net worth or that of his clan, then things changed. They'd get real close to him. He didn't need to dress in button-down shirts or wear a Rolex because he had money. He was a bear shifter. He'd happily spend his time fishing and cuddling with a woman. Not just any woman. Nita. Nita didn't understand the surprise on Kai's face. How could he think that because he enjoyed different things than she did, it made him somehow undesirable? Hell, the way he looked in those glasses, like a hot college professor, made her thoughts go straight to the gutter every few minutes. She was having a difficult time reminding her body to stay in control.
"Anybody home?"
Someone called out. It sounded like Liam. "We're back here," she replied and stood. The last thing she wanted was to make a bad impression on his clan member. There was a brief struggle and some giggles when Kai tried to keep her sitting on his lap. She stuck her tongue out at him and ran around the table to sit across from him. "You do know I have to go home today." She watched him for a reaction.
"I'll come with you," he offered. "You don't need to make the drive home all alone."
She grinned. "No way, Mr. Bear. It's been awesome, but I have some work to do." Her stomach twisted in fearful knots. Was she going too fast too soon with him? Maybe trusting her instinct that this was the right man wasn't what she should be doing.
"I can make it worth your while to stay."
He waggled his brows. Huh. She didn't need to say that he definitely could make her stay. All he had to do was say the word.
What's so funny?
Liam asked, walking out from the kitchen. He had a t-shirt that said "Born to be Wild" on it. I have to go home, she answered, wrapping the towel around her torso in a more discreet cover-up.
Already? I thought for sure the chief would find a way to keep you here.
He winked. Her cheeks heated with embarrassment. Believe me, it wasn't for lack of trying, but I do have a job to do, and I kinda ran out of clean clothes. Liam shrugged. He filled a glass with iced tea and took a gulp.
Clothes are overrated.
My thoughts exactly, said Kai. She choked on a giggle, trying to keep a straight face, but failed miserably. Figures you guys would think that. She eyed Kai's naked torso, slowly lifting her vision up to meet his gaze. His smile told her he knew she was bullshitting. If she could figure out a way to keep him naked, then she'd happily allow it. I'll go change. She stood to go to the small cabin, but stopped a few feet away and turned back to Kai. I might find myself taking some more time off. If I'm invited back, I'd happily return.
Are you leaving already?
Liam asked. No, I'll be back in a few. Liam waved as she walked away. By the time she reached the cabin, her phone was buzzing with text messages from Tolly, Mrs. Wilder, and one from Kai. His was the only one she wanted to see.
No invitation needed. I want you here with me all the time.
She grinned like a fool and went to take a shower. She'd probably lose her job taking all that time off, but she hadn't taken vacation time in a few years. All those hours of unused time off were going to come in handy now. She knew what she'd do. Go home and get more time off, then visit Tolly and Mrs. Wilder before heading back. So what if she looked sort of desperate? She liked being with Kai. It wasn't all about sex either. He was a genuinely nice guy. That meant more to her than anything. Seven. Nita took longer than she anticipated showering, dressing, and packing her bag. By the time she returned to Kai's cabin, Jess was there, but there was no sign of Kai. Hi, she said to Jess. I'm heading out. Don't want to wait until it's too dark before I go. Do you know where Kai went? Jess winced, her hands gripping some oven mitts before she finally threw them on a counter. There's a problem he went to handle. I don't know when he'll be back. That didn't sound good, especially not the way Jess said it. I guess I'll go home then. Shit. She'd really wanted to see him. Maybe kiss him goodbye. Give him a hug. Ah, damn. She was much too attached to the big guy. Distance was probably a good thing. He has my number, and we'll talk when he isn't so busy. She strolled forward to give Jess a hug. Thanks so much for feeding me while I've been here. Oh, you're very welcome. Jess sighed. She patted her on the back and marched to the front of the house, where Nita's energy saver was parked. I'm just happy you're back. Nita stopped by the door and turned to Jess. Back? Jess's sparkling hazel eyes filled with happiness. Yes, I'm so happy that Kai finally got you back. Say what? Got me back from where? Oh, she gushed. You know, you were his first love back in high school. Oh, my God. It couldn't be real. She had to be kidding. Kai wouldn't have withheld that kind of information, would he? His first love? Let me think. Jess's brow puckered. You guys were like 14 or 15, I think. Anyway, he'd gone to live with one of our uncles at Silver Falls. He and my dad didn't get along. But that's another story. You went to the same school. Jess grinned. I'm sure you've talked about it already. but I just think it's so awesome that you're here, and he's got the woman he always wanted.
Silver Falls. The word resounded in her head like a painful drum. Jess's words were drowned out by the painfully loud beat of her heart. He'd been her high school best friend. Jess gave another hug.
Drive safe and come back soon. I know Kai will be counting the minutes until you do.
Right, she mumbled, and slid behind the wheel of her car. She got lost in her thoughts. Hours flew, one after another, and her mind turned to a complete mess of questions. Why hadn't he told her who he was? She felt like a fucking idiot for not putting two and two together. He didn't look so much like he had back in high school that she'd assume he was the same person. The vile taste of acid rolled up the back of her throat. Bastard. How? She asked herself. Her phone rang repeatedly, but she refused to look at it. She was hurt, angry, frustrated. An emptiness took hold of her chest. He'd lied to her. It didn't matter that it was by omission. For every mile she drove, the sense of desolation and sadness grew. She got home late that night, having spent hours stuck in traffic, with nothing to do but think. Hectic sounds of the city surrounded her once she hit the main roads. None of that mattered. After a quick shower, she lay on her sofa, trying to decide what to do. The days with him had been so nice, so perfect. Why would he choose to not tell her about their past if he'd had feelings as Jess said? Thump, thump, thump. She jerked up on the sofa, her heart beating double time. Had the building fallen around her and she hadn't noticed?
If you're in there, open up, Nita,
Tali yelled, her knocks bouncing off the door.
I'm 10 seconds from calling the police and filling a missing persons report.
Scurrying to open the door, she almost fell over her slippers. She cursed her tendency to trip over her own 2 feet and jerked the door open. Tali shoved her way in without waiting for an invitation. Come in, she said sarcastically.
What the hell, Nita?
Tali asked with shock. Then she gave her a once-over and frowned. What's wrong? What happened?
Nothing happened. I'm tired.
Bullshit. Ark. She hated that Tali knew her so well. She could tell when Nita was upset.
Really, Tali, it's not a big deal. I'm unsure where this is going with Kai.
Tali marched for the kitchen, ignoring Nita's words, as if she'd said come in instead.
What are you doing?
Nita asked. She followed after Tali into her small but open kitchen.
Tea. It's too late for coffee. I'm surprised Theron and Connor aren't here with you,
Nita said of Tali's mates. Wherever Tali went, the men followed. Tali sat down on the breakfast nook and motioned her to take a seat. They don't need to be here with me. This is girl talk. Nita raised a brow.
What did you do? Leave them in the car?
Tali sighed. No, I'm an independent woman. I can get around without them. I did it for most of my life. She shrugged. Plus, I warned them that if they even suggested coming along, I'd probably stab them in their sleep with a fork.
That sounds more like you.
Forget about me, Tali stated. What happened to you? Why do you look so sad? Tali stood and got teacups and sugar, and then proceeded to unwrap something from a bag she'd carried in.
Is that...
Yes, cake. I knew that if you weren't answering me, you'd need this. Okay, maybe she wasn't too upset that Tali had shown up. Besides, Tali was probably the only person she trusted enough to tell how she felt and discuss what had happened.
Tali, you didn't have to.
She forked a piece of cake and shoved it in her mouth.
But I am glad you did.
Tali sat down again, her arms resting on the kitchen table. Okay, so what happened that things went from you having a great time with Mr. Beautiful Lies to you being home moping?
I'm not moping, she grumbled. Disgusted with herself, she slammed the fork down on the plate. "He lied to me." Tali's scared, wide-eyed stare almost made her laugh. "Lied how?" She inhaled sharply, trying to rein in the anger over the bear's sly omissions. "He is the Kai I knew back in high school." Tali's eyes got even wider. "Wait, the one you said was your best friend?" "That one," she growled. "You didn't notice this when you first saw him?" Tali sounded as confused as she felt. Welcome to the club, sister. "I need some liquor. This tea shit ain't gonna cut it." "Nita?" Tali burst into laughter. "What? It's true." She remembered her first view of Kai, half naked and passed out on his kitchen floor. "As for noticing, no. He's changed. A lot. He's all big and buff and—" "And what?" Tali asked, leaning forward. "And sexy as hell. He was a cute guy back in school, but he had braces, and his hair was kind of long. He was shy, so he was always hunched over a little. God," she hissed. "I must have been really stupid to him, not knowing he was the one guy I trusted back then." "Oh, Nita, I'm sure he had a reason not to tell you." "Yeah?" she snapped. "What? Because as far as I'm concerned, he was my best friend. You'd think that after the friendship we had, he would be acknowledging that right away. Besides," she huffed, "his sister said he'd been in love with me back then. More of a reason for him to tell me who he was." "But, honey, men are stupid." "Yes, we know that. But he's smart. This is Kai Stone. He was in advanced classes, about to head off to an early college program. He's really fucking smart. So he can't use stupidity as an excuse when he's a genius. And—" she groaned, shoulders dropping. "Tali, he's so sexy. He did things." Tali blanked. "What things?" A hot shiver ran down her spine. "Things no man had ever done with his tongue. I swear my legs melted to the floor the first time we had sex." "Damn, girl." "Why would he do this?" she asked herself more than Tali. Kai had changed, not just physically. He was hiding things from her. That's not something the younger version of him had ever done. They'd been honest with each other. There had been more than just friendship between them. A special bond had formed, and now she wondered if what she felt was all an illusion created by the new Kai Stone. A lie. "I think you need to talk to him." "If I see him, I won't be responsible for my actions." Already she visualized smacking him upside the head with her frying pan. That would teach the bear to mess with her. She didn't care that he was bigger and buffer than her. She had Latin genes on her side. "Stop and think for a second. He treated you so well while you were up there with him. You had a great time. You got to know each other," Tali said suggestively, "in every sense of the word." "I also opened up to him. I told him things only you know." "I'm sorry, Prima." Tali placed a hand over Nita's on the table, squeezing her in an attempt at comfort. "We'll figure it out. If you need me to go up there and castrate him, say the word." Tali had grown a lot more aggressive since her mating to the two wolf shifters. It helped Nita feel better to know her cousin had her back. Not that she wanted to truly hurt Kai. The more she thought about it, the more she worried she'd developed more than just feelings of attraction for him. She never felt so hurt or distraught over a man. It didn't matter that she'd only spent a handful of days with him. Kai was an anomaly. He'd slipped in through the cracks and gave her emotions a run for their money. She hated to admit it, but she feared she fell in love with him. This was so not the way things were supposed to go. Kai tried again to reach Nita. Nothing. They'd had an amazing time together. He couldn't figure out what happened. His cell phone rang just as he was getting ready to leave his house.
Liam? I'm down by the river. There's a group of outsiders here. I'm coming, he growled. He'd decide on Nita later. As it was, the fishing problem needed resolution. He stripped out of his clothes and dashed out of the cabin. No more asking nicely. The bear grunted, ready to take control. As he ran, the shift took over. His bear roared the moment he was out. Anger over his missing woman, and now the trespassers, meant the bear wanted to knock some heads off. He arrived at the river bend in time to catch David and Liam fighting with some brown bears. They didn't seem to be from the neighboring clan. He roared loud for all to hear. The fight didn't stop, but two of the bears left, scared. Then Kai noticed a large brown bear off to the side, watching him. The brown made a dash for Kai. Kai waited for the other bear to reach him. He knew that scent. It was a neighbor from two clans down the mountain. He'd been in talks with them for use of the river once in a while, but nothing definite had been decided. It seemed they'd taken it upon themselves to go fishing at his river anyway. The bear swung, digging his claws into Kai's fur. Kai's bear roared with rage. He bit and shoved at the other animal, doing some serious damage with his own claws. Black bears were the most dangerous out there. They shoved back and forth, Kai biting on the side of the brown bear's muzzle. Roars and growls sounded all around. His attention was focused on the brown trying to best him. The brown huffed, tackling Kai and trying to take him down. Unfortunately for him, Kai wasn't chief of his clan just for show. He tackled with his guards all the time for fighting practice. Kai slammed a giant claw on the brown's neck. The brown pulled back, almost falling on his back, but he regained his balance. A loud, pain-filled roar sounded from the brown. Kai bit down on his neck. The brown pushed away at the same moment Kai knocked him on the side with his claw. The brown bled from the neck wound. The bastard didn't give in, though. "Get off of my land," Kai growled through their animal link. He slammed into the side of the brown and took him down. The brown shoved back, finally knocking Kai on his ass. They were both on their feet in seconds, Kai shoving and biting at the other bear's muzzle once again. The brown tried using his claws to inflict pain in Kai's side, but the anger over the trespass, and even worse, his frustration over his missing mate, kept him from dwelling on the pain. Kai hit the bear on the shoulder where he'd bitten. To add to the pain he knew the intruder felt. The brown bear bit into Kai's arm. Fiery throbbing took hold of his limb. Kai didn't stop. He used the moment to his advantage, and once again burrowed his canines into the brown. The metallic taste of the enemy's blood hit his tongue. It pushed the bear even more into a feral state of mind. He shoved at the brown, knocking him down and pinning him to the ground. The enemy huffed, kicked at Kai's stomach, and tried to get him off. Kai jabbed his claws into the bear's arms and pushed him further on his back. He bit the side of the brown's head, tearing at one of the bear's ears. The brown shook, trying to get out of his hold, but only managed to get a massive gash on the side of his face. Loud roaring sounded from all over. "We'll go," the brown finally whimpered. "If you come back, I won't let you walk out of here alive," Kai promised, still holding the brown down. "Do you understand?" "Yes," the other man mumbled between whimpers of pain. Kai stood and roared loud, a warning to those standing there fighting his men. If they returned, there would be no getting out alive. The group left. One limped away. The other helped carry the bear Kai had almost killed. He, David, and Liam stood there, watching the intruders go for a few minutes before finally shifting back into their human bodies. They had some gashes, and in Liam's case, a pretty ugly wound on his side. But overall, they were fine. They dove into the chilly river water to bathe the blood off their bodies.
8. Back at Kai's cabin, David asked the question Kai had been dreading.
So, when is Nita coming back?
Those words did what no amount of fighting had done. They opened up gashes in his heart. He couldn't get in touch with Nita. He didn't know what was wrong. All he knew was that she'd left and hadn't even said goodbye. They sat in his backyard, drinking beer from a cooler. Liam had the grill going, and on any other day, Kai would have thought it was one of the best ways to spend some time relaxing. Not so that day.
She's not,
he replied.
What?
Liam asked, stopping the beer midway to his mouth. He closed the grill top and marched for the picnic table.
Why not? She's not answering my calls. I don't know what the hell is wrong,
he growled. Liam frowned, chugging down on his beer.
She didn't seem upset at all when we left.
That's what's killing me, Kai said, rubbing a hand over the back of his wet neck.
The worst part is I don't have her address.
He raised a hand when David opened his mouth.
She's unlisted. I checked everywhere. Why do you think it's been hard to find her all these years? It's not like I didn't try.
David slammed his bottle on the table.
I got it.
He smiled.
What? I do have a brain. I'm more than just good looks and charm, you know.
Liam laughed and returned to the grill.
What is it you think you got?
David smiled at Kai.
How did you find her again?
I didn't. My sister called the paranormal dating agency and somehow got her to come. David raised his bottle as if he'd just cured all the world's problems.
I rest my case. You still haven't made any sense, cousin it.
Liam took burgers off the grill and brought them to the picnic table.
The dating people, they have her address.
The misery-consuming Kai suddenly dissipated.
You're right.
He stood and turned to his house.
Where are you going?
Liam asked.
Did I just cook all this food for you to leave it? You sound like a wife,
Kai joked, no longer distressed.
David and his beard will help you get rid of it. Ha ha, real funny,
David said, holding his beard out of the way to take a bite of his food.
You're right,
Liam agreed.
I'll make sure he eats more than the beard. Don't you have a woman to go get?
David argued.
Quit it with my beard. The woman who falls for me will love it. You and I have to talk,
Liam said, turning back to David.
That beard, bro, it's gotta go.
Kai headed for his cabin to dress and get in touch with the woman who ran the PDA. He knew that was the fastest way he could get Nita's address, but he also knew he'd have to plead his case in person. He doubted anyone would just hand off client information because he was in love. He would lay on the charm when it came to the owner of the service. One thing was for sure. He wasn't leaving her office without Nita's address. No way in hell. Kai knocked on the door to Mrs. Wilder's apartment and tried not to stress. Jess had told him Mrs. Wilder was sort of brusque, but very good at her job. She then proceeded to hug him and wish him luck. When he'd called Mrs. Wilder from the road, she'd refused to speak to him over the phone and said he needed to come to her house if he wanted anything discussed. The scent of fresh-baked honey buns filled his nose. His stomach growled. So did the bear inside him. Shit, he'd forgotten to eat. Mrs. Wilder's door swung open to a petite, older woman with raised brows giving him the once-over. My, you are every bit a bear, aren't you? She whistled. Check out those big arms. Just enough hair to make a woman want to rake her nails over them. He wasn't sure what to do. It wasn't that he hadn't been hit on by older women before, but this was uncomfortable and a little scary. Thank you, he said, shifting from foot to foot like a schoolboy. Mrs. Wilder continued eyeing his arms with renewed interest. Well, come inside. I don't have all day. He snapped out of the weird younger man being eyed by a cougar moment and followed her inside the apartment. "Go on and sit in the living room. I'll bring you a snack," she called out from the kitchen. "I know you big guys like to eat." Did he ever? He sat down on one of the large sofas, taking up every bit of space, and feeling like a giant. She finally showed up with a tray piled with honey buns. The twiddling of his thumb stopped. "Go on and grab one. They're not going to bite you," she smiled. "But I just might." He needed to get the information on Nita's address fast. Mrs. Wilder had that predatory smile that he knew all too well. He took a honey bun, placed it on a small plate, and took a bite without making a mess. At least he hoped he hadn't made a mess of it all over his face. "So, now that you're sitting and that bear of yours stopped growling for food, what can I do for you?" She filled a cup with tea and honey and placed it next to his plate.
"Nita, I want her address."
She didn't stop pouring her own tea. Instead, she nodded and added sugar in complete silence. "And why should I break my client's trust and give you that information? If she wanted you to have it, she'd have given it to you herself." He picked up a napkin and wiped his fingers.
"She could be in trouble. Something had to have happened. When she left, she said she'd be back, and she's not answering her calls. She hasn't returned."
Mrs. Wilder frowned and picked up her cell phone. She pressed some buttons and then waited for a moment. It buzzed. She stared at the screen and put it down. "Nope, she's fine." Fuck. That meant it was him. He'd had to have said or done something to upset her. Maybe she wanted him to outright tell her to stay versus sending her a text. "Did you and Nita talk while she was there?" Mrs. Wilder asked, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear.
"Yes, of course we talked. We did a lot of talking."
She leaned on one of the arms of her seat. "Did you at any point tell her who you were?"
"Oh, shit." "No, I thought about it at first, but I liked that she didn't have the image of my scrawny, insecure self from high school in mind."
She snorted and picked up her cup. "You silly boy. If she cared about you at all back then, don't you think she'd be happy to know you're the person she's been matched with?" He didn't think of that. All he thought of was her seeing him again as the boy who stuttered and couldn't tell her how he felt. "Has she changed from how she was back then?"
"Yes, she's different, more self-assured, sexy, still just as beautiful,"
he replied. Mrs. Wilder pursed her lips. "And the time she spent with you, did you keep seeing her as the little girl you fell in love with, or as the woman she is today?"
"No, she's still just as sweet as she was back then, but all grown up. The time we spent together only showed me new facets to the girl I knew. It reinforced what I concluded when I was 14, that she's the one for me."
It hit him then. He'd fucked up. Big time. Instead of being honest with Nita from the beginning, telling her who he was and how he'd felt back in high school, he'd withheld the information, and she'd found out about it. Mrs. Wilder watched him like a hawk. "You know, I don't follow society's rules. I match people based on my gut, and a little extra. I'll tell you this. I know you two are a good pair." She picked up a folded piece of paper from the coffee table. "Here, and for Christ's sake, tell the woman how you feel." He nodded and took the paper like she'd given him a sacred document.
"I will."
"Word of advice. Cut it with the lies, even by omission. Women hate that."
"Yes, ma'am,"
he said, staring at Nita's address as if he would magically transport there. Mrs. Wilder cleared her throat. "So what are you waiting for? Go get your girl." He jumped to his feet. Excitement bounced in his chest.
"Thank you, really."
She smiled and waved at him dismissively. You can pay me back by sending more clients my way."
He laughed and marched for the door. "I will. I have 2 in mind that can use your help."
"Wonderful,"
she said as he ran down the hallway.
"Good luck."
Half an hour later, he'd pounded on Nita's door multiple times. No one answered. He wouldn't leave until he spoke to her. His phone rang just as he vowed to sit by the door to Nita's apartment to wait for her. "Hello?"
"Change of plans, Bear."
It was Mrs. Wilder.
"Your girl is headed to your house. I just heard Tolly mention it to her mates. Get your ass in your car and catch up to her. She was very angry when she left," Mrs. Wilder said. "Try not to make her wait. Might add to her already agitated state and get you into even more trouble."
"I'm on my way now." He moved toward the building entrance, with the phone by his ear. "Do you know why she decided to go to my house?"
"Apparently Tolly convinced her to talk to you and hear your side of the story. This is the one for you, Bear. We both know it. Fix things with her and you'll be a happy man."
"I plan to. I might break some speeding laws to get there, but I'll see her soon." He ran out of the building and hopped in his Jeep. He'd reach Nita and hopefully get her to listen to him. Nita drove like a bat out of hell. She finally slowed down once the visibility turned low in front of her due to the large amounts of rain.
"Stupid big sexy bastard," she growled. "Does he think he can just lie to me and get away with it?"
She gripped the wheel.
"Make me fall in love with him and not tell me who he was,"
she mumbled, pushing back the urge to cry.
"He is so dead."
She'd finally given up waiting around, trying to figure out what the hell possessed Kai to not tell her who he was. Instead, she was going to confront him head-on. Only thing was the weather kept slowing her down. Stupid rain. Why did it have to come down in buckets now that she decided to go over there and see Kai face to face? By the time she arrived, it was dark. She shoved the pepper spray in her pocket out of habit and searched for an umbrella. There was none. The lights in his cabin were on, but nobody came out. Growling internally at the lying bear, she hopped out of her car. Pellets of rain slid down her arms and head. She was soaked before she got a foot away from the car. The pretty dress she'd worn, in order to tease the bear, clung to her like a second skin. The thing had probably turned see-through. Hair plastered on her skull, she skidded through the mud and grass toward the cabin. Knowing Kai was usually in the back, she ran for the kitchen entrance and found it locked. What the hell? She knocked repeatedly, went as far as yelling, but nobody seemed to be around. Then she thought of the creek. It was possible he was there. In his bare body, he wouldn't care about the rain, like a woman with frizzy, curly hair would. Her hair was like a separate entity with a mind of its own. She didn't want to think about the hours it would take for her to dry it, then tame the fro into submission. That was what she'd gotten from her ancestors. Gorgeous brown skin, and a Brillo pad for hair that took Herculean strength to keep under control. Squinting against the harsh drops of cool water, she turned toward the creek and slammed into a body. She glanced up to meet a very angry face. The apology died in her mouth. She took a step back, but the guy grabbed her by the arm. "Hey!" She tugged, but the guy squeezed harder. "You're his female. I sent him on you." The guy's voice sounded low and angry. "I'll show him to fuck with me." She glanced down where he gripped her arm. His fingers were claws, digging painfully into her flesh. "What the hell are you doing? Let me go!" "No. He shamed me in front of my guards. I won't let it go. I'll teach him a lesson with you and then kill him," the man growled. A car approached from the distance. She couldn't see who it was, but either Kai was finally home or someone was coming to visit. She tugged on her arm again. "Let go, you jerk! If he shamed you, then you did something to deserve it, you asshole!" Instead, the guy pulled her arm harder.
She swore he'd torn it out of the socket for a second before he dragged her down the path by the baby cabin.
"You're coming with me,"
the guy yelled.
"He beat me in front of my clansmen. I'll kill you and him."
What the hell? She glanced over her shoulder, watching another body appear in the distance. She slapped the brute, but he didn't stop. "Kai!" She screamed his name at the top of her lungs, hoping that it was him who just arrived. The man jerked her harder down the path, pulling her toward the river's edge. She slipped on the mud, her feet covered in wet earth through her open sandals. Wearing the pretty shoes and dress had been the worst idea she'd had that day. "Kai!" she hollered as loud as possible. A massive roar sounded at her back, then another. Closer. The guy hauling her stopped. He shoved her out of the way, and she fell on the mud with a splat. Rain thundered and fell harder.
"I'll kill you,"
the guy yelled at Kai.
"I'll do what my men didn't when they came to your cabin. I'll destroy you. Your river will be mine," he bellowed. "I let you live last time. I won't make the same mistake twice,"
Kai said through the booming rain. The moonlight allowed her to make out what was going on. A roar sounded from the stranger, and he tore through his clothes with his shift into a big brown bear. She crawled back and away from him. A glance to her left showed an even bigger black bear running toward them. Kai. There was no hesitation. He growled and threw himself at the other bear. They tumbled midway down the hill and stood. She got up, rushed to them, and watched from a safe distance. Both men were covered in mud. She only knew Kai by size. He was bigger and louder with his roars. He slapped the other bear hard on the face. She winced at the sound of bone cracking. The smaller bear hit Kai's arm and shook his head as if trying to tear a piece of him off. Fear exploded in her chest. She wanted to help Kai, but how? She didn't have a death wish. She was the human out of the three of them, and would most likely die for getting in the way. Nine. Nita towed the sandals off her feet. Creeping closer to the fighting bears from the side, she pulled out the pepper spray from her dress pocket. She couldn't stop staring at the fighting giants. The brown bear was in deep shit. His muzzle was in Kai's mouth, and Kai was biting down. More sounds of crunching could be heard coming from the two. They clawed at each other's arms. Huffing and growling, the two bears continued to battle. The brown did something at that point. He raked a claw over Kai's muzzle and got him to let go. Kai grunted and roared again. The brown charged. They fell to the ground in a heap of arms and kicking legs. The brown bit the same spot on Kai's shoulder he'd done before. Nita winced. She knew that had to hurt. The sounds of pain and anger from both worried her. She might be angry at Kai, but she didn't want him dead. Oh no, she wanted him very alive, to make him grovel and pay for lying to her. Plus, she loved sex with him. Hell, who was she kidding? She loved him. Standing there watching the crazy fight only sealed the deal in her mind. Now he just needed to hurry up and kick the other bear's ass so she could give him a piece of her mind. They were on their feet again, shoving and tugging back and forth. With each movement, they got much closer. It wasn't safe for her, but she decided she had to help somehow. The brown careened forward, pushing Kai straight into a massive tree a handful of feet away from her. Kai fell on his back. Before he had a chance to stand, the brown turned toward Nita. He didn't charge. There was no need. It wasn't like she was trying to run from him. He stood in front of her, roared, and lowered his giant head level with her face. She didn't think. His beady eyes stared angrily at her. She raised a hand and sprayed the pepper spray into his eyes. The bear reeled back and bellowed. He shook his head repeatedly, waving his paws around. Kai tackled the bear from the side. He held him down on the muddy ground and bit down the bear's neck. The attack didn't stop. Even when the brown slowed down, his movements tired. Kai continued to bite and tear at the other bear's neck. He didn't stop until the other bear quit moving altogether. A cold chill ran down her spine, along with a thread of fear. She watched Kai stand and turn to her, still a bear, and still looking mighty pissed. There were cuts and gashes all over his fur. She couldn't tell how bad they were from the lack of light and the sheeting rain. He met her gaze and prowled toward her. Instinct told her to run, to get away from him. He had a dangerous look she'd never seen before. The beast controlled him. She eyed the muddy hill. It was going to be impossible for her to get up there. She'd just keep sliding back down, making a fool of herself if she tried. Then he was there, in front of her. She glanced up and gasped. He lowered and opened his arms for her. She held on to his furry neck. There was no fear as he lifted her legs in his arms, careful not to dig his claws in her skin. Still very much in his bare body, he carried her in the direction of his cabin. It was easy for him to use the tree limbs to climb back up the hill. When they reached the creek, she wiggled in his hold. "Put me down." He did so gently. "You come back to your human body. I need to talk to you," she demanded. She stepped away from him, waiting for the shift. In his human body, she saw his cuts with more clarity. He had bruises, but nothing appeared to be life-threatening. "Nita," he called when she turned away. "I'm sorry." She whipped around to face him again, inhaling hard and ignoring the harsh raindrops stroking her body. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I was stupid," he said, stepping closer. "Don't give me that crap," she threw back. It was hard enough to keep her eyes from straying down his body. Now he wanted to feed her some corny line. "We both know how intelligent you are. Why didn't you tell me we knew each other?" His gaze dropped to the ground. His chest heaved from the shift and the fight. He looked so good wet. "I didn't want you to judge me based on the awkward kid I used to be," he admitted. Maybe he really was stupid. Her mind and body struggled for dominance. She wanted to tackle him and rub herself all over his naked body, and at the same time slap some sense into him. "Are you serious?" She turned away, blood boiling with frustration. "I can't do this." She marched toward the car, trying to ignore the icky feeling of the mud sliding in between her toes. She'd only gone a few yards when he grabbed her arms and tugged her around to face him. "What do you want from me?" His face was soaked. Water streamed down his body from the pouring rain. "I want the truth." She didn't know what possessed her to scream at him, but she already knew her feelings. There was no going back after this. If they had any chance at all, they had to be honest with each other. "The truth? Fine." He jerked her close into his arms. "The truth is, I knew from the moment I saw you 17 years ago that you were the only one for me." His gaze bore into her. The raw honesty in his eyes kept her unmoving. At first, it was an attraction, a pull I couldn't understand. When we started spending more time together, it was clear to me that we had a connection that went beyond the physical. Yes, I was attracted to you back then, even with how shy you were. Despite my inability to say a full sentence to you without stuttering from nerves, I knew you were my one. She swallowed at the dryness in her throat. Her stomach twisted in knots with every word that came out of his gorgeous mouth. "How do you think I felt? The kid that everyone picked on because I was skinnier than anyone in the clan. I wore braces and probably the ugliest glasses in the world. I had minimal self-esteem. But when I was with you, I was on top of the world." She blinked back the tears filling her eyes. She knew firsthand how hard school had been for a kid that was picked on. She'd lived it. Emotions overwhelmed her. Hope, sadness, pain, All of them swirled around in her chest, filling her heart to near bursting. She heard the raw honesty in his words, saw it in his eyes. They had more than most people ever dreamed of, a connection since the first time they met as kids. She struggled to swallow back the knot in her throat. Kai. Her heart ached. Tears burned in her eyes. So much had been suffered by both already.
Let me finish.
He lowered his head a fraction.
Do you know it broke my heart when you moved away? You never even told me where you were going. You just left.
I'm sorry. She loved him so much at that moment. He told how he felt and stood in front of her, still wanting to be with her. It was time to stop fighting it and find their happily ever after.
No, I did not tell you who I was when I woke up on my kitchen floor with you leaning over me. At first, I was in shock. Do you know how many times I dreamed of something like that? But when I realized you didn't recognize me, I thought it was for the best. I'm not the insecure kid I used to be.
He licked the raindrops that continued to fall off his lips.
Although you can reduce me to a hormonal teenage boy, I'm a different person today.
She shook her head, ignoring her soaked state and the clothes clinging to her like second skin. No, you're not. You're still the sweet, nice boy I fell in love with back then. His eyes went wide and she smiled. If he could open up about his feelings, then she could too. Yeah, I had a crush on the geeky boy that tutored me. That connection you speak of, I felt it too. And now... She glanced down at his lips, then back at his eyes. Now I'm in love with the adult version of Kai Stone. He stood there, staring at her, saying nothing. She cleared her throat. I'm in love with you, Kai. I love you. There was a heartbeat of silence. Then his lips crashed over hers. Passion flared brighter than the last time they'd been together. He held her lips captive, driving his tongue into her mouth with a new aggression she hadn't seen before. Need pooled at her core, scorching her brain cells and pushing all rational thought out the window. He tore his mouth from hers to drop kisses all over her face, down her jaw and to her neck. She didn't notice when they fell to the ground in a tight embrace, nor when her dress came off. What did burn into her brain was the feel of his lips on her skin at the same time raindrops continued to fall on them. The heat of his mouth encasing her nipple, combined with the cool drops of water, added to the raging fire in her blood. He sucked her hard nubs, grazing his teeth over them and tugging. Oh, Kai. He slid his hands down, tearing at her panties.
Yes, sweetheart, say my name. I like hearing it out of your lips.
She moaned, spread her thighs open, and gasped at the finger he slid inside her.
Fuck, you're ready for me, aren't you?
She bit her bottom lip and whimpered. I need you, Kai, He was at her entrance, pressing the head of his cock into her wet sheath.
I love you, Nita.
He drove forth. In a single, smooth slide, he filled her. A gasp of pleasure tore from her throat. Yes! He rumbled and pulled back. The heat from his body cocooned her in a warm embrace. Their lips met again. Another scorching kiss with their tongues rubbing over each other. His thrusts increased in speed and strength.
I'm sorry.
He sucked on the pulse at the base of her throat, the errant pulse that ran at 1,000,000 miles per hour.
I can't slow down,
he groaned.
I want you more than you know.
She clung to his shoulders, curling her legs around his hips. I can imagine. I want you just as bad. There were no more words after that, just his body moving in and out of hers, in powerful thrusts. Tension curled into a ball at her core. Her pussy felt aflame. She gasped and moaned, unable to speak a coherent word. For every thrust, he sucked at her shoulder. She became lost in the sensation of pleasure, the feeling of fulfillment from the one man she finally opened her heart to. He pulled out of her and flipped her on her stomach. The rain continued to fall on them, cooling their bodies. She wiggled on all fours and glanced over her shoulder at him. "Fuck me, Kai." He slapped a hand on her hip and guided his cock into her pussy with the other. Again, there was no soft and careful. He drove forward swiftly. One deep, penetrating thrust that left her gasping for air. He gripped her hips and fucked her fast, hard, with a wild animal abandon she'd never experienced before. It was amazing and perfect. There was no need for sweet words at this point. She knew he loved her. What she wanted now was for him to make the ache in her pussy ease. She needed for him to help that tightness in her muscles turn into a wave of pleasure coursing from her head to her toes. "You've always been mine," he said, tapping her right ass cheek with his palm. "God, yes." His powerful drives increased in speed. Only the sound of the rain and the slapping of his body on hers sounded in the forest. "Tell me you'll be mine forever, baby," he said, voice rough and deep. There was no question or doubt in her mind that she wanted to be with him. He was the first and only man her heart had allowed inside. "Yes, I'm yours," she moaned. "Forever." He dropped on all fours, caging her. "I'm going to take you every way possible," he breathed by her ear. "Your mouth. I love your mouth. I can't wait to see my cock down your throat." He hitched a breath, feeling the burn of her blood on boil. "Your pussy. Shit," he groaned. "I love fucking you deep and hard, feeling it close around my dick like a silky tongue." He angled his hips, and she almost saw double. "Ugh, but your ass," he grunted, moving his hand from her waist and slipping it between their bodies. He slid a finger around her ass and pressed at her hole. The sensation was more than she could handle at that moment. Even though they weren't ready for it, she wanted him to do her there so bad. She hurt from how tight her muscles were. She moaned and pressed into his finger. It slid just a fraction into her asshole. He licked her back and panted. "That's going to be the biggest treat. I can't wait to fuck your tight little hole and fill you with my cum back there." She shoved her ass into each of his thrusts. He brought his hand back up to her waist and gripped her firmly, harder than he'd done before. "I'm marking you as mine," he said. "I want you as my mate." "Do it. I'll always be yours. Only yours." He fucked her in firm, solid strokes, so harsh she swore he'd break her in half soon. His cock felt like heated steel inside her, branding her as his. He hit her at an angle. Her eyes rolled back. Christ, he was fucking amazing. He pulled her body up, switching the depth of his penetration. She moaned at the new feeling of fullness. He slipped the hand he had on her waist between her legs and flicked over her clit, rubbing on the nerve bundle back and forth. She gasped. The tightness in her body snapped. "God, yes," he roared. "Come on my dick and squeeze tight with your pussy." She screamed his name. A rush of pleasure liquefied her bones. Her muscles shook, and she'd have fallen on her face if he didn't have her tight in his grasp. Her pussy clutched at his driving cock. He moved his hand back to her waist, digging his claws into her flesh at the same time he bit her back. His body continued to wade through the pouring of euphoria from her first orgasm and the one that followed when he bit her. He growled, still biting her back, and drove a final time into her, deep. He filled her with his seed then. Her pussy milked him of his cum. It was by far the most erotic experience of her life. Blinking her brain back to reality took a while. She was still gasping for breath minutes later when he pulled out of her. He kissed her back and picked her up in his arms. She sighed and snuggled into him. They were wet, muddy, and covered in leaves. If that wasn't wild sex, she had no idea what it was. Instead of heading for the cabin, he jumped into the creek with her in his arms. She screeched when they came up for air. "Are you insane?" She slapped his shoulder and curled her legs and arms around him like he was her only form of salvation. He chuckled and kissed her. "We're dirty. This is the easiest way to get clean." She raised her brows. "Did you forget I can't swim?" A playful grin covered his lips. "Then I guess you'll have to hold on to me, won't you?" She rolled her eyes, but tightened her hold on him just in case. "You know, you're lucky I'm so patient." His flirty grin turned into a full-blown smile. "I know. I love you. All sides of you." "Flattery will get you." She sighed. "Oh, all right. It works. Especially if you promise me some of the awesome stuff you do with your tongue." He roared a laugh. "You really are great for my ego." She cupped his face in her hands and stared him in the eyes. "Don't ever lie to me again, even by omission. I won't stand for it. If you really love me, then you won't do anything that hurts me." She was all seriousness as she spoke. "Tell me the truth all the time, no matter how bad you think it is, and we'll always work through it." "I'm sorry, Nita. I'll never lie to you again." She harumphed. "Good, because if you do, I've got Tolly ready to bite your furry ass off. Trust me, she's vicious." He slid the hair away from her face. "Your cousin can stand down. I don't need her to come bite me anywhere. I will allow you to do it whenever you want, though." "Now that has some good possibilities, Mr. Bear." A month later, Nita stared at the claw marks on her hip. The night he'd mated her in the rain, he'd scratched her to mark her as his. The scratches had healed, but now she had claw marks that would never go away. He entered the bedroom from his shower, rubbing a towel over his head to dry off. "What are you doing?" She slapped her hand on her hip. "Look!" He grinned. "I see." "You think this is funny? I have claw marks on my hip and teeth marks on my back." She frowned. "I don't even want to know what Grandma Kate will say the next time we see her." "When is that?" he asked, tossing the towel on the bed and marching to where she stood. "Next week." "You can tell her you're ready to hibernate for the winter with me." He joked and rubbed his erection on her back. She turned around, curled her arms around his neck, and smiled. "You're a pervert. I didn't realize how much of one you are. I like it." "I aim to please," he said, squeezing her ass cheek. She yawned and leaned into his hug. "I need a nap." "You'll be needing lots of those soon, darling." "Why?" She jerked her head up and stared into his smiling hazel eyes. "Oh. Shit." "Yeah, that," he said. He must have seen the realization of her state dawn on her face. "This is all your fault." She tried to sound chastising, but couldn't when all she felt was absolutely happy. "Sexy-ass geeky bear. Get me pregnant and you find it funny. Now when will I ever get back to work?" "Never. You don't have to work. But if you want something to do, you can be my sex slave." "That one sounds like something we should discuss." He pulled away from her arms with a laugh. "Wait here." She stared at the claw marks on her hip again. Well, at least they weren't on her belly. With a growing pregnancy, they'd end up looking like big footprints. He returned with 2 boxes in hand. "I come bearing gifts." She laughed. "Ha, I get it, you silly bear." He frowned, then laughed as if just realizing what he'd said. He handed her the larger box first.
This is for you, a symbol of how much you mean to me.
She opened it carefully, wondering what he'd gotten her. Inside the box, there was a pendant. The pendant was a bear wearing glasses. She flipped it over and read the inscription. A bear is only as smart as the woman who puts up with his growling. She grinned. I like that. The smaller box came next. She was about to open it when he took it back.
I thought of this day since I was 14. I know it sounds stupid, but it's true.
Kai. He dropped down on one knee.
I love you, Nita. Will you spend the winters putting up with my growly ass and the summers mating with me in every way possible? Forever?
He cleared his throat.
Will you marry me?
She nodded. Yes, but I think I'd like the mating to take place year-round. I don't know if I can live that long without it. I'm pretty addicted to that body of yours. He slid the antique-style ring over her finger and pulled her in for a kiss. I love you, Geek Bear.
I love you, beautiful.
Epilogue. Jerry opened up an email she'd gotten a few days back. She needed to stop hanging out with her nephew and baking, or she'd never get her business off the ground. Dear Mrs. Wilder, my name is Alyssa Moran. I'm a coworker of Tolly's. She mentioned your services, and I've met her men. They're hot, like panty-dropping sexy. Yeah, you guessed it. I want my own hot man. I don't expect you to match me up with two of them. Lord knows one is a feast on its own. I'd love to meet a nice guy for once. Maybe a guy that likes a woman with some curves. I've always been afraid of using dating services, because men are only looking for sex, and people never look like they say. Attached is a full-body photo of me that I took today. Please don't laugh at the 3 cats. They're my only company. If you can send a man my way that likes cats, I'd be eternally grateful. Jerry glanced down at the open file on her desk, grinning. The leader of a tiger pride needed a mate. He'd been recommended by the bear. Apparently he lived in a neighboring area. The tiger needed a mate soon, or he'd be challenged for his pride. She'd need to find him someone willing to take on a hissing tiger. Time to get to work. She hit the reply button on the email and started typing. Dear Mrs. Moran, I'd love for you to come visit me so we can chat some more about what you're looking for. Sometimes the right man can be more than what my clients can handle. And sometimes they can be exactly what they need. The end. This has been Geek Bearing Gifts, Paranormal Dating Agency, Book 2, written by Millie Taiden, narrated by Lauren Sweet. Copyright, Lifetime, by Millie Taiden. Production copyright, 2015, by Millie Taiden.